by 1972, I had done a lot for the program. I had participated in the teleportation research and development activities that DARPA was undertaking between New Jersey and New Mexico and back. I had participated in holographic probes to the past and future in devices called chronovisors, which were located both in New Jersey and in New Mexico. And I had done everything that the program had asked me to do, that Project Pegasus had asked me to do, to the best of my ability. Probably the most unusual thing that we did, which was in the summer of 1972, was we jumped through a Stargate device that was at the Cerrillos Cultural Center compound in Cerrillos, New Mexico, outside of Santa Fe, to retrieve microfilm summaries of future events that were being prepared by project historians situated in the year 2045. So among the 140 school children who had been selected for Project Pegasus, I ended up being involved in some of the most advanced activities, and my father and some of the other project principals were quite grateful that I had. So in the spring of 1972, he took me up to a time lab that was located on Ridgedale Avenue and another intersection in East Hanover, New Jersey. We're still looking for that building. It had previously been a chemical company. And in the lab was a large plexiglass chamber, maybe about the size of a tennis court, or maybe the length and about half the width of a tennis court. And there was a line on the floor inside the chamber, and they would generate an emission of plasma at the end of the chamber. And when you walked into the field of plasma under confinement, in this plasma confinement chamber, you essentially experienced slipping into another time. So my father took me up to the time lab in East Hanover, and I met an individual that I had met in a previous context in Project Pegasus, and that was Dr. Sterling Colgate. Sterling Colgate had been the dean of the physics department and then the president of New Mexico Tech, the New Mexico School of Mining and Technology. And he was responsible for processing the images of future events that were being photoanalyzed and prepared at the Aerojet Corporation facility that was immediately adjacent to the New Mexico Tech campus in the early 70s. There was a C-shaped building there at the corner of Bullock Avenue and Leroy Place in Socorro, and that was the location where, for example, my father and I viewed a short film loop of one of the planes hitting one of the Twin Towers on September 11th of 2001, 30 years into the future. So Dr. Colgate was a project scientist that I had met previously on the project, and when my dad took me over to meet him over in East Hanover, I said, Dr. Colgate, what are you doing here? And then he explained to me, Andy, that the project scientists and engineers are also teleporting, just like you and your father are. And then I realized, oh, of course, it would be just as easy for you to teleport from New Mexico to New Jersey as we have been doing so frequently. And they stood there on the shop floor next to this confinement chamber, and my dad explained to me, Andy, you've done very well in the program. You've done everything that we've asked you to the best of your ability. And I had overcome a lot of fear traveling to other times and places. There was sort of a sense of existential panic that I was sometimes coping with, concern that I would be lost in time and not be able to get home to the present. And so I had dealt with a lot of those feelings in just doing what they were asking me to do in the project, which was teleport places, be immersed in past and future places, mostly past places, in the chronovisors and so forth. So this was sort of a treat. And my dad said, we want to treat you to something special. And he said, do you want to go to Gettysburg and see President Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address? And my mind immediately flooded with with panic, because the image that came to mind was that 1863 image of Abraham Lincoln taken by Alexander Gardner, where Lincoln is staring straight forward and sort of looks like a chimpanzee in a suit. You know, to a fifth grader, Abraham Lincoln could be a pretty scary individual, just based on his historical photographs. And I kind of hemmed and hawed to the point where my father became embarrassed, and Dr. Colgate sort of leaned in to the conversation and said, to my father, well, Ray, let's give Andy a week or two to see whether he wants to go to Gettysburg so he can make up his own mind. So I literally marked the calendar back at the house in New Jersey and followed every day for the next 2 weeks, because I knew in 2 weeks my dad would drive me back over to the time lab in East Hanover, and they would ask the same question: do you want to go to Gettysburg to see President Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address? So we went through the same drill. My dad took me over there. I remember going over the railroad tracks on Ridgedale Avenue as you drive up to East Hanover from our home in Morris Plains. Actually, we'd go up Route 10 for a while and then connect to Ridgedale in that location northwest of Morris Plains, and then go up to East Hanover. And I remember going past Florham Park there, which is another small town in New Jersey. So we arrived at this essentially 2-room brick building immediately adjacent to the intersection there. And we walked inside, and my dad and Dr. Colgate again stood in front of me and asked me the same difficult question. And to please my father, I said yes, even though, you know, my stomach was tied in knots and my heart was pounding out of my chest. So my dad said, great. And he kind of steered me across the shop floor and said, Andy, this is Valerie. She's going to dress you in clothing that fits the historical period. So this young lady who was working for Project Pegasus introduced herself as Valerie, and she took me into a dressing room, very much like what exists on a Hollywood set. It was basically a room about the size of a bedroom that was literally covered with historical clothing from different eras. I would say at least 200 articles of clothing. And she said, Andy, we're going to outfit you as a Union bugle boy, because we just want you to blend into the historical environment. And so we decided to dress you as a bugle boy. And I said, am I going to be carrying a bugle? And she said, no. And I said, why not? She says, because you don't play the trumpet, you play the saxophone, and we don't want somebody to ask you to play your bugle. So she outfitted me in this immaculate new Union bugle boy's outfit with a hat, this dark blue jersey, these pantaloon plants, and these shiny new black shoes. And she said, she took me over to the mirror and she said, how do you look? And I said, great, I'm ready to go. I was starting to get excited about going there, you know, looking at myself as a Union bugle boy in the mirror. And then she walked me out of the dressing room, and I kind of went ta-da like that to my dad, as if you would when you just been bought a new suit of Sunday clothes. And then my father took me over to a drawing table, kind of a drafting table, and he showed me a mimeograph of a historical map of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863. This wouldn't have been troop movements from the Civil War. This was more in the nature of just a surveyor's map of Gettysburg and the land, the farmland surrounding it. And my father showed me that in Gettysburg in 1863, there was a north-south arterial that then branched off and connected with a road that went north by northwest. And he said, we know this road was here in 1863 because it's still there. And we want you to walk into Gettysburg so nobody sees you suddenly appearing there, because it's a small town in Pennsylvania. They just had a big battle there 4 months before the day that President Lincoln gives his address there. So we want to drop you off in this nondescript location northwest of town. And it's right here, and you put an X. And then we want you to walk in either direction on this northwest road. And the first person you reach, ask, hey friend, which way Gettysburg? And the people of that time period are very courteous to others, and somebody will clearly help you and point you in the right direction. then explained that when I got on the right road and walked from north down south into Gettysburg, there would be a set of shops that had a sort of a sidewalk in front of them. They were broken up. They almost looked like houses, he said. And if you go south into town, the dais where Lincoln is going to be giving his address is going to be over on your right near the cemetery. And Lincoln's going to be coming from this distance over here. And he put an X farther to the west. He's staying at the Wills Hotel. He's going to walk east toward the dais. But if you walk south into downtown Gettysburg, you're going to have to wend your way over to the right to reach the platform that he's going to be speaking on. So when you get into town, just ask somebody, where's Mr. Lincoln going to be giving the speech? So that was basically it. I didn't have a lot of training about Gettysburg. I didn't really have a special seminar on the Civil War or its terminology or anything. And they had me go into the plasma confinement chamber, and we did a kind of a dry run. And they said, okay, Andy, next time you walk past that line into the plasma, you're going to find yourself shooting through a series of tunnels. But just relax. It's going to happen automatically. You're not going to have to do anything. And then you'll find yourself popping into view on the side of the road that your dad showed you northwest of Gettysburg. So just gather yourself up and try to find your way to Gettysburg from that location. So on the actual probe, I walked into the field of plasma that was sort of sparkling with an opalescent hue. There were different pastel colors that you could see forming in the field of plasma. And I walked into the field of plasma, and I almost felt a sort of a trapdoor effect, because I then suddenly felt everything falling away from me. And I was moving rapidly through branching tunnels or wormholes in the quantum plenum. And this is really hard to describe if you haven't experienced it, but let me try. Basically, I felt myself falling feet first. Just as we had moved feet first when we would go take probes to our own future in the Montauk chair earlier in the project. But this was a sense of actually falling through a set of tunnels. And I would go in one direction in these bright amber-colored tunnels, and then they would branch in all these chaotic directions. I would shoot through one tunnel, and there would be a quick course correction, and I would be heaved in the other direction. And this went on for quite a long period of time. I would say maybe, I don't know, a minute. It was becoming very, very traumatic. And when I would be turned in another direction as these tunnels branched off, these wormholes sort of corrected where I was going, I realized that part of my clothing was torn off. My hat flew off, my one shoe, and then the other shoe was pulled off my foot and lost. And even one of my socks was lost. And so then I found myself suddenly popping into view on the side of a dirt road with a substantial amount of fog. I could see maybe for 20 or 40 feet around me, and I could see through the fog to maybe a farmhouse, a tree. But I was hot, I was dehydrated, and I was cold. And I stood up, and I kind of looked at myself, and I checked to see my hat was gone. I looked down at my feet. I only had one sock on. My shoes were gone. So I thought, well, if I now walk into Gettysburg wearing no hat and no jacket and because I hadn't been outfitted in a jacket in New Jersey, they just put me in this thick jersey, Union Bugle jersey. And so I sat back down again on the ground, and I pulled the other sock off, and I stood up, and I threw it behind the bushes because I didn't want to walk into Gettysburg in a state of undress. I'd rather be barefoot than just have one sock on, because then that would attract attention, and we were always trained to avoid any kind of attention that would cause us to be detained, arrested, jailed, confined in somebody's office or house or what have you. In fact, we've been told to even lie to people we encountered when we were time traveling, because their great concern is we would be stuck in a location like a small jail cell where they would be unable to extract us if they needed to put a portal in to take us out of a particular location. But this was a one-off journey in a form of time travel that I was exposed to in this probe to Gettysburg and a few other minor probes that I really have have trouble recovering the significance of. They seem to be around the immediate area. Those may have been training exercises or something. But this was for the purpose of going and seeing one can get the Gettysburg Address. So I then started to walk arbitrarily down to my right, down one direction on the road. And about 10 minutes later, I saw through the fog. The fog was beginning to clear as the morning progressed. And I saw a tall, gaunt man, maybe about 19 years old, dressed as a Union soldier. And he was walking along the side of the road, pretty much lost in his thoughts. I can't discount the possibility that he was a young soldier that had been experiencing trauma from having been in the battle. He seemed pretty much lost in his thoughts, almost sort of roaming the countryside. And I yelled, "Hey, friend, which way Gettysburg?" And this tall, very thin, gaunt young man quickly turned around and squared his shoulders in the direction that I was already looking, both the direction in front of him on the road, and pointed with more deliberateness than we would use in our time, indicating that I should continue to walk forward because I was walking in the right direction. Of course, there was a 50-50 chance that I would be, because there were only two directions to walk down the road when they put me down on the side of the road. So I guess instinctively I selected the right direction. And I continued to walk behind him. I let him kind of walk ahead because I didn't want to talk to him. So he then sort of walked ahead on the road in front of me. I began to shiver so badly that my teeth were chattering. And the well-trammeled earth of Gettysburg, presumably that troops had traveled on by foot, was very cold to the bottom of my feet. It was almost flake-like. And after about, maybe about 20 to 30 minutes, I began to see that I was walking into, initially I thought just past houses, and then I realized as I got into this cluster of gray sort of 1- and 2-story homes that I had actually reached downtown Gettysburg, because I realized that some of these homes that looked very much like some of the residences that were along the side of the road with some farmhouses and so forth, but which looked a little bit more elegant and which had sidewalks in front of them, were turned in a way that seemed to create a downtown, must be downtown Gettysburg. But I really struggled to see whether I had arrived in downtown Gettysburg, because I was expecting a much bigger town. It was just like a town in the Old West that you'd see in a cowboy movie, except the houses were sort of, there were more farmhouses than Western ranch style. And when I got into downtown Gettysburg, I could see that there would be something that looked like a 2-story house, but there was a wooden sidewalk in the front, so that 3 of the adjacent stores were connected to each other. And because I was shivering and wanted to get some clothing, I started to look into the store. I was hoping to go in and ask somebody for a jacket and maybe some shoes. And I was staring into a millinery shop. And during the Civil War, a millinery shop was basically a men's accessory shop. It had things like ties, tie pins, and jackets, and socks, and shoes, and so forth, suspenders. And so I was staring in this millinery shop when on the wooden sidewalk in front of the store, shop, and on my right, this old man came barging up onto the sidewalk, hobbling severely from what looked like an injury to his upper leg. So he was really hobbling. And he was 70 years old, and I remember what he looked like. He was a very colorful figure. And in other words, I later could remember from memory what it looked like. And he said to me, boy, what are you doing out here in the cold without a jacket on, without any shoes on? You're gonna catch your grip, lad. Which I imagine was catching cold or getting the flu or something in Civil War parlance. And he said, come inside the shop here, and I'll get you a jacket and some shoes. So he took a skeleton key out of his pocket, and he opened the front door. And I followed him inside, and he went to the back wall, the flip room, which was sort of the store area of the shop, where different men's accessories were on racks, on display, and so forth. And he went to this shelving unit that was on the back wall, and he tried several pairs of shoes and held them down to my feet. But none of the shoes that were there, which were all men's shoes, were going to fit my 10-year-old feet. And he said, well, let's try these. And he got a pair of sort of the worst pair of shoes on the wall, which was a kind of a beat-up pair of mint brown street shoes. They weren't military boots. They were actually civilian loafers, or what I would call some street shoes. And he put them down on the ground and stuffed packing paper into the toes of the shoes. And he said, well, try that. And we took a long time, actually, maybe about 10 minutes. He was ferociously stuffing people in the front of the shoes. I don't think he realized how oversized the shoes were and what difficulty I was going to have walking in them. But finally he got enough paper in the front of the shoes where I could sort of shuffle around the shop. And when I was testing out the shoes, a woman in a Civil War dress, period clothing, walked through the front of the store and confronted him. I think she was confronting him, why are you sharing our merchandise with this young, or whatever she perceived that I was. Or maybe she thought I was what I had been dressed in, which was a Union bugle boy. But as they were having that conversation, and she was kind of confronting him, and I could see that he was trying to make up an excuse as to why he was helping me, my perception of time sped up very rapidly and then slowed up very rapidly. So I had this interlude of sort of time dilation that I think was some kind of sensory effect of plasma confinement as a form of quantum access. It was almost as if I had been artificially inserted into a past time, and the way in which my time signature related to the environment somehow got off kilter, so that I heard her speaking very rapidly to him, and then the speed reversed, and they were speaking even lower than normal, and was sort of suspended. So among all the time travel that I did for DARPA and Project Pegasus, the jump to Gettysburg was one in which I could really perceive the difference between myself and the quantum environment that they had sent me to. It was almost as if I had been incompletely inserted to that time and place, and I might pop out of it if something happened. Because I had a sense of density, and I noticed the strange time dilation, or actually time acceleration, and then time dilation when the woman came into the shop and confronted this man. She then left, and he said, come on, lad, let me find you a jacket. And so I shuffled behind them to the storeroom behind the shop. And on the floor there was a lot, maybe 20 to 40 men's jackets. It was a huge pile of jackets, many of them of military issue. All of them navy blue. The ones that were military jackets were navy blue. I didn't see any Confederate uniforms. And he said, well, he dug into the stack and he said, let's try this one. That's about your size. And the first jacket that he put on me fit. It was sort of a somewhat closely fitting, but nonetheless properly sized Union winter parka. And he said, well, I think that'll do, son. Listen, I've got Mr. Lincoln's going to be in town today. I've got a presidential speech to listen to. And he kind of hobbled out of the shop. And in fact, I don't even think he locked it behind me. He may have, but he hobbled out of the store. And I shuffled behind him. And I now knew, based on my training, that this was going to be somebody from that time and place who could lead me to something. In this case, if I just followed this man, he would be taking me to the Lincoln speech site that my father said was going to be over on the right, and I walked into Gettysburg from the north, on the main north-south arterial that goes through Gettysburg. At least it did in 1863. Presumably it may still do so. So we went over. I followed him, and I kind of broke away from him because he had just told me by putting shoes on my feet. I didn't need a jacket, and I didn't want to elaborate. I didn't want to just continue to stay with him, because then he would have possibly described to another local citizen that he had just helped me find shoes and clothing, and I was concerned that would lead to a discussion of who I was. So again, following my training, I kind of made myself scarce, and so I walked over to the west side of the dais. And there were very few people there when we went over there. So I can confirm that this individual was one of the first people to go over the dais and wait for President Lincoln to arrive. Now, let me just spend some time describing who this man was. He was a man that I visually recognized from my experience there. I had a clear eidetic memory of his face. I also described, long before I found out who this person was, that he was a man about 70 years old, and that when he walked up on the wooden sidewalk, he hobbled towards me as if he was nursing a very serious injury to his leg. He wasn't just limping; he was somebody who had been severely injured in the leg. Recently, he was in pain. I also described how he voluntarily helped me. I was just looking in the window of the millinery shop when he came at me, half running, to help me get in warmer clothing. He was the first citizen that I met when I walked into Gettysburg, which I also think is significant. And I also had described how he had personal access to the millinery shop, which had men's shoes in it, because he had the skeleton key in his pocket. Well, I did a little historical research, and I found out who this individual was. He was a man by the name of John Lawrence Burns. John Burns was a Gettysburg cobbler who, as a young man, a very young man, had been one of the first volunteers to the war of 1812. As an old man, when the Battle of Gettysburg was moving through and on the outskirts of Gettysburg, literally through its streets, a part of it was fought on the streets of Gettysburg. John Lawrence Burns took a musket and volunteered himself as a Union sharpshooter because he had been a soldier during the War of 1812. He had volunteered for both of those wars, and I see an analogy to the fact that this man was going out of his way to voluntarily help me. During the Battle of Gettysburg, he had been injured by a musket ball in the upper leg. And so when I encountered him 4 months later, on November 19th of 1863, the day that President Lincoln went to Gettysburg to give his famous Gettysburg Address, John Lawrence Burns was still nursing an extremely serious gunshot wound. After he was wounded during the war, he was captured by a Confederate regiment. He explained to them that he was a citizen of Gettysburg who had just wandered onto the battlefield and had been wounded, and he was surrendered. You think of the gallantry of both sides during the war. He was surrendered under a flag of surrender by the Confederates who were holding him to the Union regiment, because the Confederates chose to believe that he was a hapless citizen who had been accidentally wounded. And so he survived the war. He was repatriated off of the battlefield, and he was still nursing his combat wound when I met him, when I time traveled there from 1972. The other thing we know, he was a cobbler, and it was the shop I was looking into that he let me into, which had a number of a great number of men's shoes. They were lining up shelving in it that went around the entire back wall of the shop, both new shoes. It's kind of interesting. So John Lawrence Burns is one of the eternal proofs of my subjective claim of having time traveled as a child attached to DARPA's Project Pegasus, because before I identified who John Lawrence Burns was, I was telling people about this particular trip to Gettysburg, how he voluntarily helped me, how he was about 70, what he looked like, the fact that he was hobbling on a severe leg injury that seemed recent, he was in pain, or at least kind of wincing as he walked along the sidewalk towards me, and that he had some connection to the shop. So this is one of the more remarkable proofs that I present, and also, of an extrinsic nature, or actually intrinsic, more that go to the facts of what happened rather than my later investigation, where, for example, people who were on the project affirmed to me that the project existed. This goes to literally the inherent fact of what I experienced when I was on the project as a child. So when I found the pictures of John Lawrence Burns at Gettysburg Pablo, I said, that's the guy who helped me. And so, what do you know, there were 4 or 5 facts pertaining to Mr. Burns that correlated with what I projectedly experienced when I traveled to 1863 via plasma confinement from the time lab in East Hanover, New Jersey, under the direction of Dr. Sterling Colgate of New Mexico Tech, who was lecturing during those years about plasma confinement. That's something I found during my investigation, my second fact-finding investigation to New Mexico in 2004. He also went on a distinguished career at the Los Alamos National Labs in quasar research, and of course, Los Alamos, I had long implicated in Tesla teleportation activities that were being undertaken by Project Pegasus, and also the role played by Dr. Harold Agnew, the director of LANL, who was the federal science administrator who was responsible for Project Pegasus when I was on it. So I've been able to identify the science involved, Dr. Colgate, the man that I met in Gettysburg, John Lawrence Burns. And that's been pretty exceptional because in most of the probes to Past the Future I did, I had no knowledge of who I was meeting or who I met. For example, when we were jumping forward in time to 2045 from the Stargate and Cerritos, we were just being given those microfilm summaries of future events, and they wouldn't even tell us where they were located or what their name was. And we only learned what year they were in by asking some of their technicians back when we were in the present who were fixing the Stargate device what year they were from. So usually local knowledge like that would be concealed from us as we were engaged in project activities. Or we had difficulty discerning from locals who had no connection to the project because they spoke another language or they were simple people from a past time and place and so forth. So it's really remarkable that I was able to go back and isolate a fairly obscure Civil War figure as the man that I encountered there in Gettysburg. So after I followed Burns over to the dais when Lincoln was going to be soon arriving to give his address there, I noticed that 2 ladies dressed in Sunday best over on my left were looking over at me and gossiping about me under their fans. And that's how kind of demure they were acting, because this was November 19th of 1863, and I was kind of startled that they were carrying fans, but I guess they were because the president was arriving there, and they were trying to look demure and so forth, and stylish. But these very well-dressed young women were looking over at me, and I know they were noticing what kind of clothing I was with, because they were kind of looking down at me, almost like, who do you think you are, you young carpetbagger, to be dressed in clothing from the battlefield like that. That's disgusting. It was sort of like that. That's what I've now realized must have been going on. I didn't at the time. I only noticed that they were giving me more attention than I'd been trained to tolerate. So I walked away from it. I reached the front of the dais, and I looked over to the man on my left, and I realized it was my father. My father, Raymond F. Basiago, was one of the project principals of Project Pegasus. I had first teleported between the old Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility and Woodridge, New Jersey, sometime between September of 1967 and September of 1968, to participate in a meeting that my father was having with Dr. Agnew at the Los Alamos National Labs. But since most of my activities in teleportation and chrono vision and these other forms of time travel, such as the Montauk chair, or in this case, plasma confinement, involved myself and the other children in the project, I didn't really have a larger view of the situation. My father was also engaged in some of the time travel. And I looked over at him and could see that he was dressed as a fireman. And I said, Dad, what are you doing here? I didn't know you were going to come. And he kind of ignored me, and then he said something like that, continued to question him. I finally turned and said something like, boy, I'm not your father, or something dismissive like that, in a kind of a rural. Now, my dad had been born in rural Summit Hill, Pennsylvania, in a coal mining family, Polish immigrant family who were coal miners in Summit Hill, and yet had after graduating from Lehigh University with a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering in 1951, had nonetheless gone on to participate in some of the most advanced aerospace projects that the United States launched in the 1950s and 60s. He was a principal on the ramjet engine project at Curtiss Wright, where he worked on metallurgy to see how they could design an alloy to build the engines of the ramjet that wouldn't melt, and the hull of the craft that wouldn't melt from friction in our atmosphere. He had worked on the B-70, which was one of our strategic bombers, and he was also a principal engineer on Project Pegasus, which was the U.S. time-space program at the time of its emergence in the late 1960s. So I really didn't have an understanding when I was being trained and immersed in all the different time travel journeys that I went on in Project Pegasus, that my dad was participating more directly than this, in fact, revealed to me. So now having the rather discombobulating experience of having your father state that you weren't his son in his past of time, which kind of caused me to experience a surge of panic, like, oh my God, here I am in 1863, and my own father doesn't recognize me or was ignoring me. I then walked around him and stood over on the left corner of the dais. And it was there that I encountered more people began to gather, obviously. Time was passing. Lincoln was going to be arriving. More people began to cluster around and stand there. And there were two Union officers standing at the corner of the dais. And one was very handsome and had a mustache and was leaning against the corner of the dais with his left arm, kind of like a dandy, kind of looking around at the crowd like he was the best-looking guy in the United States. You know, the John Wilkes Booth, right? And the other guy was very homely and had a stubbled beard, you know, pretty big growth of beard, and was disheveled in his Union uniform, and was eating an apple by peeling it with a parent knife and then slipping a wedge of apple in his mouth. And he bent over and put his mouth, his face with apple juice dripping from his mouth right in front of my face, and said, "So, boy, are you separated from your regiment?" And I said, "No, sir," and looked over at the other officer and said, "Well, listen, boy," and then he looked over again, got right in my face. "Do you know where you're bivouacked?" I looked up at him and said, "What's bivouac, sir?" And he turned to the other officer. This bugle boy doesn't know what bivouac means. Now, of course, this may have been a security detail for President Lincoln. I don't know if they had the kind of protection that we have today, but it was probably a lesser form of security, far inferior to what the Secret Service now provides the president. But nonetheless, they seemed to be scrutinizing me just to find out who this Union bugle boy was, separated from his regiment, just standing there without a bugle. Because I was in the distinctive jersey and pants of the Union bugle boy, so presumably, he referred to me as a bugle boy, so I think he knew that I was dressed in Union clothing. Of course, with oversized shoes and a Union adult, winter parka on, which probably attracted their attention as well. I guess there was always the prospect that I was a carpetbagger who had, been rifling the clothing from the parade that had been lives on that battlefield 4 months previously in July of 1863. And so he turned to the other officer, I believe the commanding officer was the dandy who was standing there leaning against the dais, I think was a higher ranked officer, if I'm not mistaken. He said, "Oh, this bugle boy doesn't know what bivouac means." And then he sort of gets down on one leg and he looks at me and says, kind of leans in even further and says, "Boy, have you seen too much battle? Are you being touched in the head?" And I said, "Yes, sir," because I thought, well, maybe if he's crazy, he'll stop questioning. Because again, I had this gnawing fear that I would be arrested, and this was something that they really cautioned us strenuously to avoid being detained or arrested in any way. And these were officers who were asking me why the hell I was there. So I was concerned they were actually going to, jail me in a military prison or something. So I said, "Yes, sir, I am," realizing that they would stop questioning me. They both almost doubled over, laughed hysterically when I said it, that yes, I was touched in the head. And I think that revealed some of the cynicism and the battle fatigue. Here are officers that may very well have either served in the battle, had actually been in the Battle of Gettysburg or been part of Lincoln's security detail or just been local officers. And by 1863, in Gettysburg, many of those officers would have been in multiple battles already. We know from our Civil War history. And I think of how, of what great humor they found in my response and the sort of the diehard cynicism of their demeanor, and sort of laughing hysterically at what I said. And so I think that goes to how stressful it must have been to be in the Civil War era as an officer or a soldier, watching your comrade basically have their gut shot out around you, and with musket balls, shot in the head, shot in the legs, the arms, abdomen, have these grievous battlefield wounds that they almost had no chance of surviving, having the limbs cut off if they did. After the Civil War, the biggest industry in many towns was prosthetic limbs. And I think that goes to the grievous damage that was really done to that generation by the Civil War. But these gentlemen laughed almost hysterically when I said I was touched in the head, because they clearly, I think that showed that they had seen more than their share of the fight. So I had four pretty disturbing encounters. First of all, when I was looking to find some clothes, maybe a jacket to put on, or some warm socks or shoes or something, because my teeth were literally chattering. I was that cold. I had this pretty vigorous encounter with John Lawrence Burns where he went out of his way to help me. And even that violated the security protocol that we were supposed to follow. We were supposed to avoid interacting with local citizens as much as possible, not disturb anything, not to try to change any events, not to pick up and move anything, not to pick up anything and put it in our pocket, and so forth. We had basically been thoroughly schooled in the prime directive to not interfere with the we would change the pattern of the timeline that we were set to. And that might involve things like difficulty getting us back on our timeline and so forth. So even the encounter with John Lawrence Burns was something that had kind of mildly troubled me. I felt utterly ridiculous when I shuffled in my oversized shoes behind him to go over to where Lincoln was going to be getting the Gettysburg Address, because I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm going to see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, and I'm wearing these stupid oversized shoes. I was literally stuffed like a toddler, shuffling around the living room in his dad's slippers. I mean, I hardly walked. The shoes that I had to push the shoes forward, like snowshoes. So I then had the encounter with the ladies who were gossiping about me. I had a very strange encounter with my father standing right in front of where Lincoln was going to be speaking. That's kind of an internal proof, because I realized I was describing how he was front and center in front of the stage. I realized that everything I was told during that experience, and then had discussions about with my father later, he had also been sent there to see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, and was right on the spot where he'd be able to do so. He was maybe about 3 feet back from the dais, 3 or 4 feet in the dead center of the dais, from left to right. So he had found his spot and was waiting for Lincoln to show up. But nonetheless, he didn't recognize me. That disturbed me. Then I was literally questioned by these two Union officers. So what I did was, I walked in diagonal away from the dais to the right, because I knew to the right side of the dais is where Lincoln would be arriving from the Bills Hotel. So turning my back to the dais, I walked to the right about 100 paces, knowing that when I got there, my back would be to the dais, and Lincoln would be arriving over to my left. So people would be looking at where Lincoln was coming to the dais, and I would be behind them with my back to them, and they wouldn't be able to see that I was wearing an adult Union winter parka, and that I was wearing these grossly oversized men's street shoes, more like a carpetbag than a Union bugle boy in an immaculate uniform and black shoes. And because I was especially concerned about the shoes, I put my left foot forward, my that if somebody saw my legs in that position, they wouldn't notice how big my hips were. And it was in that position, looking to the right, intentionally looking, trying to look nonchalant, knowing I had my back turned to the dais would soon be arriving to stand on, intentionally looking the opposite direction from where I knew he would be coming, that a photographer from that era, who I believe had no connection to Project Pegasus and the press, just somebody there taking, a picture from that era of citizens of Gettysburg gathering to see President Lincoln give us a address November 19th, 1863, took a photo of the group, and I'm in it. And that is to say that the first photograph to capture an image of President Abraham Lincoln on the dais at Gettysburg on the day he gave the Gettysburg Address there also is the first picture to capture a time traveler from the future. And I was that time traveler. And I've described how I was inserted in that past time and place. I was inserted there by a plasma confined chamber located in a small brick building that had previously been a chemical company on Ridgedale Avenue and a cross street in East Hanover, New Jersey in 1972. And the child in that shot, you can see, is wearing an adult parka and very oversized shoes. This photograph was uncovered in 1951, 10 years before I was born in 1961. Did it exist historically during all those years, or was it only created when I went back in time? And did it suddenly appear in 1972? No, because I was inserted artificially as a time traveler into that time and place. I was in that scene the same day that Lincoln was photographed there. So I was always in that scene. In fact, the image of me as a 10-year-old was taken in Gettysburg and fixed on that photographic negative and produced as a photograph 98 years before I was born in 1961. There is no paradox of evidence that's created in the past when you're sent there. When you're sent there as a time traveler, the evidence that you leave there has always existed there. So in this case, this will help people understand the paradox of whether, did that image of me take place in 1863 and was it brought forward in the historical record? Or would that photograph have suddenly, would the photograph of Lincoln suddenly shift and have me in it only in 1972? Well, the answer is, I was always in that photograph because I had always been sent to Gettysburg the day that Lincoln gave his speech there. The only problem is that there was a difference in the causation by which I got to the grounds of that speech and this photograph there. So the photograph was discovered in somebody's collection in 1951. It was published in Life magazine in 1952-53 time frame, and then it was republished in, we believe, Life, we're still looking for it, or one of the other major news magazines in the early 1970s. So when I had already traveled to Gettysburg in spring of 72, in the late spring, early summer of 72, I found that photograph in a contemporary news magazine in our town. And I took it to my sister, and I said, look, got a picture of me when I went to Gettysburg. And she said, when were you at Gettysburg? And I said, they sent me there in Project Pegasus. I was sometimes called Project Pegasus Learning Lab, and it was only a kid after all. And the Learning Lab was how I viewed it, because it was in the Learning Lab at my grammar school, which was Mount View Road Elementary School in Seton Hills, New Jersey, where they had educated us for participation in time travel. And so I may have very well said to my sister, that they sent me there in the Learning Lab. But, she grabbed the magazine from me and said, which boy? And I said, that one right there, that's me. And she said, that's not you. That's just some kid from that time period. And she read the caption. She said, that couldn't be you. That's a picture of when President Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And I said, it is me. He sent me here. And she said, no, they can't do that. Mm-hmm. So I then took the news magazine, and I took it to my dad, who was just in his reading chair. This may very well have been Sunday. He's reading Sunday New York Times. And I said, Dad, look. And he said, I see it. And I said, but they got a picture of me when you sent me to Gettysburg. And he said, yep. Just don't talk about it. I'm like, it is me, isn't it? Just don't talk about it. So he already knew that the historical photograph existed. Now, as a result of standing there in that location, I was photographed by a period photographer. I'm virtually certain, as I said, that it was not a team that Project Pegasus, because the project was trying to conceal our location from present events. For example, I had once asked my dad, why don't you send me to Dealey Plaza on November 11th of 1963, and I'll be able to see who shot Kennedy? And he said, we can't do that. And I said, why? And he goes, because the assassination of President Kennedy was recorded by a lot of cameras and still cameras and motion picture cameras and news cameras and so forth, and you'll be seen there. So based on the pattern of concealment of our time travel activities, that was sort of the overarching model of operational security that the project was being carried out under, sort of this umbrella of strict secrecy. And my dad, telling me that it would be impossible to the site of the Kennedy assassination of President Kennedy, because I might be photographed there. I don't believe they would have sent a photographer to capture me in a location where you can hardly even verify the Lincoln's on the dais there, because you may recall that when that photograph was found in 1951 and been scrutinized over the years, that was during the emergence of photo enlargement technique. And that was one of the first photographs that they analyzed to capture just several pixels of Lincoln's head and blow it up. So in fact, if they had been trying to capture one of us at the Lincoln speech site, I think they would have done a better job of capturing President Lincoln in the image. So that's another piece of evidence that indicates that it was taken just serendipitously by a photographer of that era and not by somebody trying to capture an historical image on behalf of Project Pegasus. So I was standing there probably, and this was really the remarkable thing relative to the photographer's presence, I was only standing there for about 2 minutes when I experienced this overwhelming sensation of sort of like a kundalini sensation. I began to feel sort of a super excitation of every cell of my body. And instead of wormholing back East Canada, I just kind of like blacked out momentarily, sort of like right when you're falling asleep under anesthesia. I kind of went into a twilight sleep state, just kind of slipped into it. And I opened my eyes, and I was back in the plasma confinement chamber at the time lab at East Hanover, New Jersey. My father was displeased. Dr. Colgate, my dad, had given me this treat, this unprecedented privilege to go back to see how Abraham Lincoln looked, not only see what Lincoln looked like in life, but see him giving the Gettysburg Address. And I had not done so. I had failed to complete my mission. Actually, it wasn't a mission. It was really just a privilege. My dad was upset that I hadn't made the fullest use of my time in Gettysburg. And he came sort of almost half running across the shop floors with the speed that John Lawrence Burns had approached me on the sidewalk there in front of the millinery shop in Gettysburg. And he said, what were you doing? I said, what do you mean, Dad? I was trying to speak to President Lincoln, give the Gettysburg Address. And he says, no, you weren't. You were just standing there like a goddamn statue. And I said, Dad, that was where I was standing to try to not attract attention to myself after I confronted the ladies and you. What did you want me to do? And he said, I wanted to see Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. So I had this major Bart Simpson moment. I know I had done what the project had trained me to do. I had wanted to see President Lincoln and see him give the Gettysburg Address, even though the idea of seeing him was frightening. But when I was there, I was sort of overreacting to what was going on, and I ended up kind of throwing the mission. I really probably should have been a little bit more relaxed and stood in some other location there near the dais, like maybe a couple of feet to the right from my dad or something. But I was really kind of spooked by all of the confrontations I had had there, trying to stand there, and so my training was kind of tripped, and I ended up doing everything I could to not attract attention to myself, but the net effect of that was I missed seeing Lincoln at Gettysburg. And I wouldn't even be surprised if I was also being motivated somewhat out of the fear of seeing Lincoln, because I was contemplating seeing him in his beard and everything as he looked like in life. It really was sort of a nice prospect. So I guess I was being oversensitive actually when I was sent there. I was kind of concerned that I would see Lincoln. And nonetheless, I was sort of triggered to do what I was supposed to do, which was avoid detection, arrest, detention, imprisonment, and so forth. We were even trained to avoid any extensive questions. So when the officers were questioning, I was extremely nervous, because I was afraid, as I said, that they were going to arrest me. Okay. So during the quiet time of the next several weeks, I asked my father. I asked him, about seeing Abraham Lincoln, and I said, "Well, what did you see?" He said, "A man in a beard giving a speech." These were colloquies that I would have between my dad and I during a lazy Sunday afternoon or something, where my mother and my 4 older siblings had no idea what we were talking about, and we would even talk about these things. Let's say if my mother was in the kitchen and my siblings were out in the front yard playing something or something. In other words, my father and I were having conversations like this in a context in which people could have overheard what we were saying, but nobody ever noticed what we were talking about. We were sort of semi-public in our discussions about what we did on Project Pegasus, knowing that nobody would understand what the hell we were talking about. So he said, yeah, Lincoln, he was just a bearded man giving a speech. And I said, well, what did he sound like? What did he look like? He said, well, he had a black beard. He looked just like he does in the pictures. And then my dad said, well, there's one thing. Actually, I didn't ask him what he sounded like. My dad volunteered. He said, well, there's one thing I do remember about him. I said, what's that? And he said, I couldn't believe how high-pitched his voice was. I said, what do you mean? He said, when he was giving the speech, he sounded like this. 7 years ago. And my dad imitated with his very dry, high-pitched voice. And we now know that Lincoln had Marfan syndrome, which is a disease of the connective tissue that may have not only explained his length, but his height, but the length of his neck, and the possibility that his Adam's apple and his vocal cords were actually elongated too because of Marfan syndrome, which would have explained why he was speaking such a high-pitched way. So it took me several weeks to really get over the stinging sense of sort of having blown that mission. I really had profound regrets, almost a sense of loss that I had lost the opportunity to see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. And I said to my dad, well, can you go back and send me? And he said, no. And I said, why? He goes, because then there'll be 2 of you there. So I had lost the one opportunity I was going to have to go to that. This was the actual delivery of the Gettysburg Address. It wasn't a version of it, another timeline. They were using a form of time travel that got you to a specific location in time space on the timeline that you were traveling from. So if I had gone back via plasma confinement, leaving East Hanover at a later time, there would have been 2 versions of me captured in that historical photograph, or at least present at Gettysburg at that time. And I said, well, wait a minute, Dad. You didn't leave via confinement on the time I did, and then you acted like you didn't know me when I was there. When did you go there? And he said, on a previous day. Actually, he said, at a previous time. And I said, really? But how could you be there? And he said, because they sent me to November 19th, 1863. And he said, in fact, that's when I first learned that you were going to be in the program. So what I'm saying is the age of my father, when he was standing there in front of the stage where Lincoln was going to give the Gettysburg Address on November 19th of 1863, was younger than the father that I was then talking to after I had been sent there, because he had been sent there on an earlier day from our time, but nonetheless intersected with my journey there when I was at an older age than he recognized. So he knew that later in his career and in my upbringing, my childhood, I was going to be attached to Project Pegasus. Now, when we consider, and I did notice that my dad looked a little younger. He looked more like the age I was when I was about 4, which would have been 1865, would have been 1965, 56, around the time that I entered kindergarten. So we also know that because we teleported from Curtis Wright to the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds between my 6th and 7th birthday, period between September 1967 and September 1968, my father knew by that time period that I was going to be in the program because he had teleported with me from New Jersey to New Mexico. So his trip to Gettysburg must have been in 1964, 65, 66, and no later. And I think from that we can date the fact that Project Pegasus was operational by the mid 1960s. I've reached this time period very late in my 10-year investigation of my experiences in Project Pegasus. The first quantum access experience that I had subjectively was the teleportation at age 6 to New Mexico. And this trip to Gettysburg occurred when I was already 10 going on 11. But I'm saying that since my father was clearly there from an earlier time, and he subjectively stated that he had no knowledge, he saw me in Gettysburg, that I would be in the program, he must have been sent to Gettysburg no later than 1966, the year that I entered kindergarten. So there's been a lot of interest in this photograph. There's been very interesting feedback from the public about it. Let me just share some of the remarks I've gotten more than once about the photograph. Many people notice that the child seems out of place. I can be found in the photograph, in the foreground of the photograph. It's a group of men standing there talking, and I'm in the left center of the photograph, looking to my right, which was the opposite direction Lincoln was going to be arriving in, on the left edge of the photograph. So many people have said, the child looks superimposed in that photograph. Some people have stated that there could be a kind of an energy field around me, and even an entity standing to my right, which would be the left side where I appear in the photograph. Several people have said, well, when I saw this photograph of Lincoln, I knew there was something historically significant about it, despite the fact that it captured Lincoln and gave it the Gettysburg Address. Oh, and by the way, germane to that subject, I am about 99.99% certain that Lincoln was sitting down on the dais when he captured that photograph after arriving on the dais. There's, I think, an outside chance he was getting up from his seat to deliver the Gettysburg. The reason I say that, I think it's consistent with the position that his head is cocked in the small group of pics that show Lincoln's head in that crowd scene at the back of that photograph. And the reason I say that is he had not yet arrived on the dais when I decided to walk 200 paces diagonally where I ended up being photographed in that historical photograph. I don't think he would have had the time to get up and even sit down in that time period because I didn't hear any cheering or anything. So I believe that Lincoln had just arrived when I was photographed and wasn't getting any applause, for example, after giving him the address. But then, he probably would have got cheers when he first arrived and then more uproarious applause after he finished. But then I think the possibility is that the weariness of the war, they had just had a big battle there. Lincoln was an unpopular wartime president. I'm not sure we have any historical evidence that there would have been a cheer when he arrived or any cheers or applause when he finished his address, because it was a very mundane setting. I mean, it's basically right there near the cemetery. There was some patriotic bunting around the dais, but this was not a glorious, presidential address with a huge crowd. It was a crowd of only several hundred people ultimately, maybe even fewer, and a very rudimentary platform. And I don't remember hearing cheering behind me when I was, strenuously looking to the opposite direction. So that begs the question of whether he even got applause when he came onto the stage. Anyway, so I'm standing there, and I was describing the responses of people who were contacting me. So some people, noticed that it looks odd. If there's something strange about the child's positioning, the light contrast of the child with the rest of the scene, the direction the child's looking seems completely unrelated to the fact that Mr. Lincoln is arriving behind him, which is consistent with my account. Everybody has noticed the fact that the shoes that I was wearing were readily identifiable as very large adult men's shoes. So there was no reason for a Union Bugle boy to be outfitted in adult shoes. I mean, they had children's shoes during that era. If I was dressed in a jersey and the pantaloon pants of a Union Bugle Boy, why would I have adult shoes on? A Bugle Boy from that era would have been outfitted in his shoes. A couple of people have mentioned that my face is very full in that photograph. It was in childhood, and it is in adulthood. I have a full face. And you can see, however, that I look really well fed relative to the people standing around me. Like one of the men standing right there in the group of people talking right near me is literally almost emaciated. His shoulders are very narrow. He has a small pot belly, but you can't see any girth on his body. So some of the most astute observers said, well, forget the shoes, Andy. You look well fed than any other person in that picture. And we can presume that in a rural setting during the Civil War, there would have been interruptions of food supply. From battles that were being taken, the Battle of Gettysburg would have disrupted the summer crop, probably outside Gettysburg. So, there was periodic hunger during the Civil War in the civilian population and among the Confederate troops. One of the reasons the North ended up prosecuting the war as effectively as it did is it was supplying better food rations for Union soldiers than the Confederate government was able to provide. So some people have said, you really do look like a modern kid because you have a full face and your body looks well fed and healthy. Another person said, you're standing in a modern way. Nobody in the Civil War era would have stood in such a kind of a way that shows a personal bravura. You look like you're standing like a young, confident American kid. The kid from that era wouldn't have possessed so much self-possession to stand in a mannered way like that. I don't know how that person concluded that. Apparently, in different eras, people affect different demeanors based on, notions of human, person or whatever. And so somebody said, no, you look like a modern kid, a kid who doesn't belong there, and you're ready to, you're affecting this sort of confident pose because you're determining what you should do next. And that's not exactly what was happening. I was actually affecting a mannered pose, hoping that nobody would notice my shoes. So anyway, that essentially was my trip to Gettysburg. I hope to someday go back to modern Gettysburg and find the location of that road northwest of the main arterial there and simply walk into town and see if I recognize any of the farmhouses, get a sense of how long it takes to walk from that location into historical downtown Gettysburg. But I stand by my account, and I think it's remarkable that I was sent to where Abraham Lincoln Gettysburg Address, and on that particular approach to the past didn't see Lincoln. I saw him during one of the chronovisor probes that was undertaken in New Mexico, the scene of his assassination. But I did not see President Lincoln on that particular trip. And yet, by following the direction the program had given me in terms of avoiding being captured, I ended up placing myself in a location where I was photographed in 1863 and could later verify it. So I continue to field inquiries from the public about that particular photograph and that trip, because we not only have the internal proof presented by everything I was talking about, my experiences before we identified John Lawrence Burns as the man who helped me and got me the jacket and shot me in the shoes, but we now have a photograph that shows me at a location at a time and place that existed 98 years before I was born. So almost 90 years.
That's just amazing. So do you think this technology exists today, or do you know of any, are you still connected? I mean, as a child, you went through all this training and you were connected to, I don't know if it was military or black ops, I don't know what you consider it today, but do you know of anybody that's still in that system or anything like that gives you any tidbits of what's currently going on with the technology?
Yeah, I think the way, the proper way of cabining Project Pegasus, it was under the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, which then was known as ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. It changed names and acronyms over the years. My father always described as what we were doing as classified defense-related research and development for the defense technical community. So it involved people like him. For example, he was the dollar a year man on teleportation. So he was working as an engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, but it was within his ambit to basically stay abreast of teleportation, so that if somebody needed to be briefed about the theory and practice of teleportation, he could be flown somewhere and give a seminar. Okay, so it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was black ops in the sense that we were basically in an intelligence program rather than an operational program where people are at, an election in a foreign country is disrupted or something like that. The different misdeeds that the CIA, for example, has been involved in over the years. But my father did have reporting requirements to the CIA. Now, there was a disruption of the program in the mid-'70s after we left it, but we know that the program was reconstituted because we know that by the early 1980s, based on my experiences and the experiences of people like Michael Relf and Arthur Neumann, that the CIA, the intelligence community in general, the NSA, were teleporting individuals to Mars no later than 1981. So even though there was a disruption of Pegasus in the early 70s after I left it, somebody had died, I think, on their way to work, and the system of calling in and keeping the project going had fallen apart. Everybody scrambled. There was also a theft of some of the project documents, the project files, as they were called, when my father and I were living in New Mexico one summer on the project. So there were a couple of threats to operational security that were very serious. But because we know from experience that the intelligence community was teleporting individuals to Mars by 80, 81. I believe Michael Relf stated that he first went up there in 1977. Arthur Neumann went up for the NSA recently. We also have the corroborating evidence now being provided by Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, the great-granddaughter of President Dwight David Eisenhower, that in 2006 she was approached in a sophisticated recruitment effort to secure her willingness to go up and be a member of the secret Mars colony. That off-planet teleportation has been operational for 25 years, actually at this point, over 30 years. Now, in terms of people on the project, there were two individuals who literally doubled back the project and provided me with information. One was Jack Pruitt. Jack Pruitt was one of the team leaders in Project Pegasus. Jack was born in 1934. He had a background as a lieutenant for the U.S. Navy. I've heard through the writer Alexander Bruce that his father knew Nikola Tesla, of course, who had designed the teleporter and was sort of the principal figure in time travel. Another hidden figure, by the way, is Enrico Fermi, because we know that Fermi consulted Ernetti and Gemelli when they were developing the chronovisor, and we know that he was also the mentor for Dr. Harold Agnew when Agnew was the administrator for Project Pegasus and working primarily in teleportation and chronovision. So Enrico Fermi is really the scientist that's kind of identified in the Montauk literature as the John von Neumann character. Von Neumann died in the 50s, and hence I don't believe he had any connection to U.S. time travel research, except maybe in some area of mathematical theory. My father, of course, was a gifted mathematician, which may explain his involvement. But Jack was one of the team leaders on Pegasus, and one of the things he did is he trained us for the chronovisor probes that were taken via the chronovisor at Morristown, New Jersey, and he was sometimes present when we would teleport and they would take roll at the Capitol grounds in Santa Fe. He later appears as the research director for Project Montauk in the works about Project Montauk written by Peter Moon and Preston Nichols. Now, initially, I had thought that those works were works of disinformation because they failed to talk about Project Pegasus and the more advanced forms of quantum access that Project Pegasus achieved, and indeed, Jack Pruitt's involvement in Project Pegasus. But now, in fairness to Preston and to Peter, I want to emphasize that I've evaluated their data more extensively, and I think we really need to have a consultation because I think what Project Montauk was probably a one-off attempt to take the Montauk chair and put it through every twist and turn imaginable to derive the net potential of that time travel device. For example, irradiating the time travel we're sitting in the chair. The Montauk chair was basically a device to prompt a pre-experience of a moment in your own future. The books by Nick and Liv about Project Montauk suggest that they were using it to get off planet and to enter other dimensions and so forth. And I never did anything that elaborate back on the program when I was a kid in the Montauk chair. The Montauk chair was just bumping our mind forward into adulthood, where we would pre-experience moments in our own future, like a 20-minute episode in your adult life. And we would then find ourselves back in the chair and would describe for one of the ladies from DARPA what we had seen and experienced. So I just want to state publicly, I've been doing my interviews, that I do believe that Project Montauk was a legitimate project, and I hail the efforts of Preston Nichols and Peter Moon and Stuart Swerdlow to share their experiences in Project Montauk with the public in the same way that I'm sharing my experiences in Project Pegasus. I just couldn't figure out in the epistemology of the two projects how the two projects related and why they would have been talking about just the chair and not talk about Jack's background. But it makes perfect sense now. These projects are compartmentalized, so many of the people working on Project Montauk would not have known of Jack's previous involvement in Project Pegasus. They wouldn't have had a need to know. And the explanation for why Montauk was just focusing on the chair is because they would have taken one of the quantum active devices if they were curious about amping up its efficacy and just done every imaginable thing with the people time traveling in that chair. And that perfectly explains what Stuart Swerdlow talks about in terms of, children dying when they were involved with the Montauk chair. So Montauk was, according to their own timeline, began in the early 80s, but hey, I first teleported in Project Pegasus 13 years earlier, and my dad was apparently being sent to Gettysburg via plasma confinement even earlier than that. So, I date the emergence of time travel in the U.S. more from around 1965 than later, about 20 years after some of these devices emerged during World War II. But yeah, so Jack Pruitt doubled back, and he met with me at a facility in Santa Fe that's been torn down. It was called the Teeny Auditorium. It was in former high school, but turned into a public auditorium. And I met his son, Glenn, who sadly is now deceased. But Glenn met me there, and his father would have arrived an hour later. Jack arrived and basically shared information with me about the medical consequences of the project. In fact, for example, that some of the teleportees were developing, the child teleportees, were developing a metabolic disease that mimicked diabetes. And he warned me that if I received the diagnosis, I could not go on metformin, which is glucophage, the oral medication of type 2 diabetes, because it'll just cause a ravenous hunger and I'll gain weight prodigiously and put my health in danger. So I abided by his advice, and I've gotten some difficulty with metabolic regulation, but I've controlled my weight fairly well. And my case of type 2 diabetes, or this disease that mimicked it, is now under control just with diet, rest, and exercise. But Jack was really showed great kindness in risking his own life to double back and talk about the project with me, that I was going to be meeting some other people that week that I was there. And I did. I had 4 clandestine meetings in that first fact-finding trip to New Mexico in June of 2003. The other person from the project that doubled back was Virginia Olds. They had been a psychologist for DARPA on the project, who was working with me in kind of philosophical and psychological counseling the summer that my father and I were living in White Rock, which was the summer of 1973, which we had accessed from fall of 1971. And we were involved in different project activities there in New Mexico. And Virginia was kind of a psychological dosage for DARPA that they put with me and just talked to me about, what was the worst thing that could happen to me when I was teleporting to another time, and using one of the other methodologies to visit the distant past and distant future, and that I could die and lose my life, and how I would go back to heaven and meet Jesus and all that. But she was kind of a counselor that they put with me for several sessions, just some conversations she had with me at the house about how not to be afraid of time travel. And she came into my life again in 2005 and shared information with me. But she was really just sort of more or less seeing how I was doing. She was just seeing how I was holding up mentally, how much whether I was having any physical problems. So those are 2 individuals who were principals on the project, who actually, of their own free will and accord, or that of the government, doubled back and connected with me and re-immersed themselves in my life and shared information with me.
Right.
And being my father or son, and knowing these fine people that I was working with, there's kind of the conundrum of the project is that my father and these kind of programmatic people were the best kind of people. The unfortunate thing is that another phalanx within the project was involved in mistreating us. There was another kind of more sinister group of people in the project who, for example, when we would teleport back to Curtis Wright, they were taking us into the engineering building there, and sitting us down and giving us about 30 seconds of electromagnetic shock to try to make us forget that we had just been in Mexico. So I don't alleviate, I don't relieve any of the people involved, including my father, from the ultimate moral responsibility of involving me. But I do believe there was a split in the program, and I was able to verify that in my discussions with Captain Ernest Garcia, who was the Army Security Attaché for the project. He confirmed that there was a kind and decent adults who included my father trying to protect him, and there was a more sinister faction that really wanted to secrecy so vigorously that they really didn't care what happened to the kids in the project.
Right. So you had mentioned that you had traveled ahead in time to like 2045, I believe.
Yeah.
Can you speak on that? Like, what did you see? What is to become of us? Like, this is 2010. Like, I know that like there's a big debate over what's going to happen in 2012 or 2020. And if you've gone ahead to 2045, did you get a glimpse of anything?
Well, that particular trip really allows us to distinguish the fact that quantum access, which is what I'm calling this broad field of using different forms of time travel to gather intelligence of events going on non-locally in the quantum hologram, which is the time-space continuum, really just allows you a slice of additional experience on another timeline. In other words, when something happens historically, we can say, okay, 9/11 happened, or okay, President Nixon resigned, or okay, we landed on the moon. Then when psychics are making predictions, or when vaunted mystics like your Nostradamuses and your Edgar Caseys are describing a discrete data point that happens in the future, somebody says, aha, that's the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. And so I'm frequently asked, okay, when you were time traveling, did you develop proof that such and such an historical event that happened did in fact happen the way it's described, or such and some future event that's going to happen is going to happen? But I try to emphasize that the only way I can make such confirmations is by extrapolations of what I directly experienced when involved in quantum access. So, for example, the visit to 2045, I can describe exactly how it happened and show you that it was just like getting on an airplane. Now, if you were going to get an airplane ride between Philadelphia and New York, that wouldn't help you prove that 9/11 happened, right? You're going to have your own ontological experiences in the normal way. The only difference is you would have gotten to that time and place through a non-ordinary means. But you're going to still have the same unraveling of diurnal time where you're living your life and having direct experience. So let me just describe the jump to 2045 and the inferences I can make about 2012.
Okay.
Based on actually remotely viewing 2012, because another thing that quantum access can do is focus on a particular event, like Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address, or like the 9/11 attacks, or like the theoretical catastrophe of 2012, and then focus on it as an intentional target, and then derive data. But let me just describe the jump to 2045, because I think this is a more valid way of evaluating what can be gotten via time travel and distinguishing it from precognitive prediction of future events. What happened was, during the latter summer there, see, we had pre-experienced the summer of 1973 because we had jumped there from the fall of 71. We then lived our fourth extra summer in New Mexico, which was the summer of 72, which we jumped to from the beginning of the summer of 72, after I left the fifth grade and graduated from my grammar school. It's now the summer of 72. We teleport to Santa Fe. We take up residence at a rental house in White Rock, New Mexico that I've identified. I've identified who from memory who the owner was, who the real estate agent was. I identified another house in that town that he owned. Okay, so I've done my footwork on proving my experiences. So we're living there at that rental house in White Rock, and that summer of '72, they were designing this huge Stargate device on the basketball court. It's a YMCA facility from the Great Depression that the Works Project Administration built outside of Cerrillos, New Mexico. It's now an art compound owned by an artist by the name of Jesus Morales. And that's to say it's no longer a civic building. There's a couple of buildings from Pegasus that are now under private ownership, by the way, which is something I'm investigating. But anyway, on the basketball court there, which was an Olympic-sized court, there's a symphony-sized stage, kind of a college music department sort of stage in the front that was very large as well. They had set up a chronovisor on that stage, but in summer of '72 they set up this huge black device that was a big arch. It was shaped sort of like an anvil or a colonial-era printing press. It was this big rectangular object. It had all different components on it. Blinking lights, shiny solenoids, wires. And it all led down to a portal that was shaped and about the size of a doorway. Let's say the kind of door you have to get into an office building in a downtown location. And there was a ramp that we were trained to run to through dense blue neon light that this device was focusing in the portal or doorway. And when we jumped through it, being in a vortal tunnel again, living at great enough speed, we found ourselves on the grounds of a vast industrial park. And there were these broad sidewalks. I remember during one of those trips I saw a man going between two of the buildings on one of those sedgeways. So I hope the inventor Dean Kingman knows that I saw that one of his ITS or sedgeway vehicles was in use in a southwestern location in the year 2045. But we were never told where that location was. And when we would go into the buildings, there were these beautiful emerald green buildings. And we would go into the building to pick up the data scrolls, and I would try to ask him, what year is it, and what's your name, these other data points from the future. And he would just sit at the table across from me and say, Andrew, I can't tell you anything. All you know is we're sometime in the future, you're teleporting here, and it's my responsibility to give you these data scrolls for you to get home with them. He then showed us, and then we continued to do this during subsequent trips, that in the conference room of that beautiful 3-story tall building was the teleport. In other words, they had recessed the return teleport in the wall of that conference. And so after he gave me the data scroll, it was my job to basically run at the wall. I found myself coming back through a portal tunnel and popping back into view in the grounds surrounding the microwave tower at the Lobo overlook point, due west of the Continental Divide sign off of Highway 160 in southwest Colorado. This is a location north of Pagosta Springs, south of Colorado Springs. When you reach the Continental Divide site, the sign that says Continental Divide on Highway 160, the Lobo overlook is up a 3-mile hairpin trail to the immediate west of that location. So there was then, and is now, a very extensive microwave array out there. Explained to us that these microwave towers are not just being used for real-time communication. The American public has been lied to about that fact. Some of the microwave facilities are actually pinging a sonic tone out into the universe so that time travel personnel in the future can identify the location, our position in time-space, and the time-space continuum. So we were being sent back from 2045 back to the grounds of that tower. And then we were retrieved by school bus and driven back to New Mexico, back to the project locations in New Mexico, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and so forth. So the Sandia National Labs to teleport home or whatever. Now the reason I know it was to 2045 is because we were walking, myself and one of the other children in the project were walking by the Stargate, and two of the technicians from the future were consulting the project personnel from our era about the operation of the device. And we asked them, what year? You don't know what year we're from? We're from 2045. So they essentially violated their own operational security protocols by revealing to us what year they were in. And I think they may have concealed that from us because they knew that some of us were concerned how far we were time traveling. And hence, they just instructed the people in the future not to tell the kids what year it is. But they ended up unintentionally being, without any cognizance on their part, they were asked by us what year they were from, and they told us. So we know that means that microfilm summaries of future events were being brought back to a U.S. defense technical project in the area of remote sensing and time around the 1970, 71, 72 time frame in a project for whom Donald Rumsfeld served as defense attaché. But I must say that we don't know whether all that data arrived because and that is to say, it's quite possible that a lot of that data might have been erased by some of the field effects of bringing it back in the future. For example, when my father and I drove down to Aerojet and were permitted to view the 20-second film loop of one of the planes being crashed into one of the Twin Towers on 9/11, there was only an 18 to 20-second loop that had been through some means, either by being filmed in a hologram by a chronovisor, or maybe being analyzed in terms of where it was situated on the microfilm. So I believe that some of the microfilm that was brought back, or a lot of it brought back by us, actually ended up being unusable, damaged. But I know that they were getting at least partial data from it. Because among the future events that were retrieved during all of these movies, using human psychics, boosting people's own minds and having them go forward in a modified care and recover things from their own future, standing in chronovisions while holograms of past and future events were being propagated, and also physically teleporting through teleporters and stargates to the immediate future and through the stargates to the distant future. Among the events that I heard spoken of when I was a child on Project Pegasus were the advent of the Internet, the emergence of AIDS as an epidemic disease, the terror attacks of 9/11, and the presidencies of President Carter, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And also, I was briefed on the role that I would play in the future involving the discovery of life on Mars. And they also had my book, so they were describing to me occasionally how I would play a role in the disclosure and bring public attention to the teleportation capability and the other life-inventing technologies that were developed in Project Pegasus that would become part of my, revealing of which would become part of my truth campaign, and I would ultimately play a role in what they were calling this important movement that would start in the future. So as a historical data point, my discovery of life on Mars and my role in the disclosure movement were things that were personally revealed to me. But those four other data points, involving AIDS, 9/11, the advent of the Internet, and the identity of the president, those were things that I either overheard inadvertently by just, taking lunch with the project engineers in Albuquerque, or as a result of personal meetings I had with other people. Mm-hmm. They weren't things that I was intentionally supposed to learn.
Right. So one thing that comes to mind is like the personal part of you. Like, a lot of times you get challenged throughout life in various areas, and where you come into an awareness. And who do you talk to about these types of things that you can actually have an intelligent conversation with? That somebody else that has done it, or do you know what I'm saying? I mean, is it frustrating to you to try to come out and tell this, or are there people that you are in contact with that understand exactly what you're talking about?
Well, that's a great question, Joe. I mean, something is happening now, where I'm succeeding in telling the entire world what happened to me. But in fact, when we were being trained on Project Pegasus, we were told that, look, you're interacting with technologies that the general public may not be involved with for 200 years. For example, teleport. I disagreed with them when I heard that. But, So they were quite aware of the fact that they were concealing and involving us in such advanced experiences, technically speaking. They said that if you talk about what we're doing, there are going to be three possible outcomes. People will either believe that you're lying, they'll believe that you're crazy, or they'll be envious. They may become hostile because they are not being involved. And if you go through the negative comments against me, when somebody's not posting just pure disinformation, like this recent false claim that as a lawyer I went to a software company that had a time travel game, well, I'm getting disinformation like that architected against me, directed against me. I've never been employed by anybody as an attorney. I've been in solo practice for 14 years since I was admitted to the Washington State Bar in November of 1996. So when I'm not having utterly engineered false facts being posted on the internet against me, when I get a hostile reaction, if you look at a person's negative reaction, when it's emotional and it's not based on quantum theory, they're almost always angry because they think I'm lying, they think I'm crazy, or they're subtly envious of not having been involved in something so far out. So because of that inevitable gulf between what we experience and what people can believe as even possible, when I would talk about my project experiences to my family members or my school friends, for example, it would just go right over their head. They wouldn't know what the hell I was talking about.
Right.
So there was an actual social impediment to being able to talk about what happened and share it with others. And so if you add on the brainwashing that they attempted when we were kicked out of the program, the fact that we had been trained, we had been counseled over and over and over again to not share our experiences with somebody who didn't have a need to know. Even somebody in authority who didn't have a need to know. Even our own mother, okay? Even the priest at the local parish. We were never supposed to talk about our experiences to anybody who we didn't know had already been given a need to know by the government to know what we knew. We were being raised basically, or side-streamed during I had a fairly happy childhood. I think maybe a very happy childhood. But in the context of these projects, I was finding myself being conditioned by the cult of intelligence to keep its secrets. So there was that influence. There was the brainwashing they attempted. There was the natural reluctance to talk about things where, I had a lingering effect that I had tried to do my best, but, it was stressful. And the experiences were so far out, I only intermittently talked about the experiences, just very occasionally over the next, until I was in my mid to late 30s, for 25 years after I was out of the project. I began going back and writing down my memories and my experiences when I was about 37 and a half. So from age 12 to 37 and a half, I only occasionally spoke of what I experienced. I remember, for example, I told one of my roommates at UC San Diego about the fact that we were teleporting because he was majoring in some science field and I knew he'd be interested. And he said, "Oh, that's incredible." He said, "Oh, yeah, I know the government did that." So really intelligent people who are aware of how much compartmentalization has occurred and how much black budgeted work has been done are often very open-minded. But just communicating about it has really been something that I've been striving to do for the last 35 years.
Right. A lot of people that I get on the show, they are of higher minds and they have a different piece to the puzzle, per se, of life. And there's a lot of common things that are common themes, I guess, if you will, from each guest that comes on. And yours is pretty unique. But you did say about traveling to Mars, and so I have to ask the question about extraterrestrial life because that comes up a lot on my show. And as far as the human origin and everything else, what is your take on that? Like, what do you personally believe?
Well, this is a pretty complex question, actually. When my father and I were attached to Project Pegasus, we encountered 3 Martian humanoids as they were leaving Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company. in Woodridge, New Jersey, to get back on their ship to go home. They had been in technical liaison with our aerospace personnel. They resembled modern humans very closely. They were just a little. The men were bald. One of the three men had a little fringe hair around his bald head. The other two were bald. The shapes of their bodies, in terms of where the muscles were located on their frame, was a little bit different than modern humans on Earth. But they were clearly human beings. I actually haven't discussed this on. I think I mentioned it on one show, but one of my law clients was a secretary for Howard Hughes of Hughes Aircraft, and she had two Martians who were in technical liaison with Hughes. Actually, Mr. Hughes was so close to her that he used to eat off her lunch plate, she said. And she was given several devices by Howard Hughes and told to give them to the men that would be showing up at 1 o'clock or whatever, who he said look like humans but are in fact Martians. So here we're starting to get different reports from within the defense technical community. In my case, a child participant. In this case, a woman who, a very elderly woman who's in my law practice, or one of my law clients, who as a young woman or a professional, as it were, also had contact with Martians. Now, take it forward to when I published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, in 2008. That paper includes details of some of the humanoids on the surface of Mars who more closely resemble the grays of the extraterrestrial contact literature. You can find that paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, with those photographs, at my Project Mars.net website, which is the website for the organization that I founded after discovering life on Mars, the Mars Anomaly Research Society. There's the paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, and there's also a shorter paper that takes the reader directly to where a humanoid is depicted in a detail of its photographs, image PIA 10214. I found the image of a humanoid on Tsiolkovsky Ridge, which is west of the home plate Plateau, in the West Valley of the Columbia Hills Basin, like the Gusev crater of Mars, which was an image that was taken in late 2007 that spoke of spirit, and then back to Earth in early 2008. And I studied that photograph throughout 2008 and then summarized my findings, published a paper on December 12th of 2008, The Discovery of Life on Mars, which contained the first images of humanoids living in their natural state of existence on another planet. Now, after that paper was published, I was called by somebody I know in the U.S. intelligence community, a career CIA officer. And this individual shared with me the fact that there are about 1 million humanoids living under the surface of Mars, and they constitute several typologies. One that closely resembles us and is genetically related to us from the time before the solar system catastrophe, when the Martian civilizations were separated, and also a group that looks more like the ET. There also seem to be some hybrid human and insect creatures on Mars, one that I encountered when I went up there in 1981, and others that we've identified in the photograph. We've also found some of these human insect hybrids in the Egyptian literature. There was a goddess named Serket who had the head and shoulders of a woman and the body of a scorpion. And we found scorpion men in several different locations on Mars. One is clearly a living scorpion. The other looks like possibly a statue of a scorpion man. So we're living in an incredible age. Living in an age when human beings are going to Mars. The U.S. government has been covering up the U.S. presence there. But even as the U.S. government to release photographic data from the surface of Mars, we're living in an age when we'll be able to explore a new world in terms of the life forms and artifacts on the surface of Mars. So the Martian population is more artificial in the sense that it includes the survivors of individuals from Earth who then got separated from Earth, and apparently a branch of the extraterrestrials that helped restart the Earth civilization after the solar system catastrophe of 2500 BC, which we believe happened when debris elements from the Bella supernova explosion entered our solar system and impacted Mars and Earth, just caused massive devastation. That actually eclipsed the Atlantis. We attribute Atlantis to a great flooding event because as fragments of that explosion struck Earth, there were massive tidal lifts and forest fires, and there was enough debris deposited into the oceans to raise ocean levels and cause massive flooding. We're looking at a Martian civilization that maybe what like the Earth civilization looks like as we become an intergalactic civilization and have extraterrestrials walking around among us rather than just visiting our planet on the basis of stealth in the manner that they have been.
Mm-hmm. So, considering that you are a lawyer and you're quite credible, has anybody come forward to try to quiet you, like somebody from the government or anything like that?
I've had a number of direct and indirect attacks on me. As Courtney M. Hunt, my CIA contact officer, explained to me once I had sort of turned him. See, he was introduced to me in 1981, and I had pretty much turned him around the time that he had a stroke and lost the ability to communicate around 2001. And Courtney died, I think, in 2005, maybe 6. I spoke to his son after his death. I was subjected to probably 30 or 40 social disruption campaigns and false attacks on my credibility as I was developing, because they knew I was destined to reveal what Project Pegasus had achieved, and therefore I was persona non grata with the Hawks and the U.S. Defense Department and intelligence community, and they also knew I would play an ethical role in the discovery of life on Mars. So they knew I was destined to be a major figure in this truth movement that we now see emerging. I'll give you one example. I mean, in law school, I was subjected to a false and defamatory attack involving a false claim of plagiarism that was propagated against me by a fellow student who, after law school, immediately went to work for Senator Richard Lugar, who is, at least then, was on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So I've had actual political attacks made on me by intelligence operatives and people either part of or connected to the intelligence community. When I was a student at Cambridge after law school, I was walking back to my flat from my college, and I passed somebody on the sidewalk, and something didn't seem right about his behavior, and I looked back, and he was training a handheld device on me, like a psychotronic weapon of some kind. And I had about 2 months of immune suppression after that, with a severe influenza that practically killed me. And I was battling a severe cough and high temperatures in a cramped apartment, in an old monastery in Cambridge for 2 months there, trying to save my life and save my degree, because I'd had the opportunity to study at a great university, and I had this attack where they undermined my immune system. I've also had direct consultation with people who have told me basically to shut up. The most serious meeting occurred during my June 2003 fact-finding trip to New Mexico, where the historian was helping me connect to different people in the intelligence community who had different things to share with me. So, for example, the first meeting was they wanted me to know that the telepathies are moving back and forth between 2 adjacent timelines, and some of that had been going on in my life. Jack Pruitt advised me about metabolic syndrome that the teleportees are developing. I met with Governor Bill Richardson up at the old car show in Chama, New Mexico, and he was quite gracious. And as one of the former project staffers, he said if he was in my position, he would be doing the same thing, and he supported my investigation. But he wanted me to know that he was the governor of the state, and he couldn't just do a press conference with me where he would reveal that he had been a young staffer on a project that had achieved time travel. But the last meeting of those clandestine meetings in 2003 in New Mexico was up in the then vacant parking lot of the Wolf Creek Path project. And I spoke with a journalist who I know his identity. I don't think he knows that I know who he is, but I've identified who he is. I had met him years previously when I was a young journalist in Los Angeles. But this journalist identified himself as representing the executive office of the president, and and was just passing along their message that if I didn't stop researching, writing about, and talking about my contact with these time travel technologies that remain, compartmentalized national security secrets, that they couldn't guarantee my survival.
Wow.
So yes, in addition to Jack Pruitt showing up and Virginia Olds meeting me all 2010s, there was that meeting in 2003 where the Bush White House basically told me that if I didn't cease my investigation of Project Pegasus, they weren't confident that I would live. Now, that was either a veiled threat. I don't know if it was. I'm not saying it is. It was. That was either a veiled threat or it was something coming, let's say, out of Don Rumsfeld's office at Defense, where they knew there was a faction by the government or the private sector or another country that would try to assassinate me to prevent me from revealing publicly what I know about the state of U.S. time travel technology as it existed by 1970. It may have been the real hardcore people in the Navy, because the Navy has always been the agency that has been tasked with developing time travel, because the Navy is the organization responsible orthographically to be seeing beyond the horizon. So over time, the Navy Department is the coordinating agency for the intelligence community, not the Central Intelligence Agency. The Navy Department is also a very significant coordinating agency for U.S. intelligence. And by that, I don't mean the U.S. Navy. I don't mean the flag fleet. I mean the Navy Department, which is a huge bureaucracy in Washington. So I had been advised by Courtney Hunt of the CIA that I should be cautious around career Navy personnel, because they would be most concerned about my disclosure effort, and I should be very cautious. He stated that in the context not of my truth campaign, but of the idea of filing federal tort claim against DARPA for compensation for the services that I rendered them. I was ultimately denied my service pay, and I was medically injured. So I had conversations with him. I was going to launch a lawsuit with Ed Masry of Aaron Brockovich, the attorney who represented the victims of that settlement pond case against PG&E that was narrated in the film Aaron Brockovich. But unfortunately, Mr. Masry died before I could work with him to launch what we call in the law a Bivens Act, which is a federal tort claim for the deprivation of civil liberties by a government official operating the color of authority. So during the period when I was having discussions with Courtney Hunt with a view having him introduce me to Ed Masry, he advised me, be a bit cautious about some of these Navy officers who were involved in both that really still do not support the release of this information. But by 2003, I was getting a message anyway from the Executive Office of the White House, and the Executive Office of the President.
So on the other side of that coin, do you think there's anybody like what some may consider white hats that are actually protecting you so you can actually get this information out?
Well, that's a tough one. I had training in how to be watchful and how to evade and how to use self-defense to protect myself in hand-to-hand combat and things like that. I don't know. I mean, certainly a network of people has grown, but I'm completely safe now. I think in a broader sense, I'm under divine protection, because I do believe that divine providence has within its intention the release of this information so that we can use it to transform life on Earth. I don't believe that in designing the human being, Almighty God planned for us to become a life form that would emerge and then die out because we were unable to construct a sustainable civilization. I think humanity is destined to play a wider role in the universe, and therefore it's the intention of God to help humanity evolve and create a sustainable civilization. In other words, I'm a cosmic optimist. Mm-hmm. I answer Albert Einstein's question whether the universe is friendly, in the sense that, yes, I believe we're created organisms and that some other planets are inhabited, and that that so much effort has been made to design the human race that our Creator God intends for us to solve our problems and forge a sustainable spacefaring civilization. To do that, we're going to have to achieve sustainability on Earth, and we're going to have to achieve and are achieving the technology to travel in space. To become an interstellar, not just an interplanetary federation, teleportation is necessary because we know from the vast distances in the universe that you need to be traveling in time ships rather than spaceships to move between star systems. So I believe that in a way that I really can't articulate, divine providence is protecting me and will protect my mission, and that my mission will succeed.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think some of the individuals you spoke of before, are they actually ETs or aliens, or do you think some may have been time travelers themselves that are from distant future and therefore they've gone through an evolutionary change that had changed their DNA per se, and they've actually come back? I mean, some of the theories that are out there are saying that some time travelers from the future are here to fix something that they have broken per se.
Right. That's been a theory that's been advanced by, for example, Dan Burrish in his testimony to Project Camelot.
Right.
I could certainly say that my father and I met Martians, and he was saying on the drive over to Curtis Wright, they're Martians, son. They're human beings like us, but they're from the planet Mars. Okay. So I know that we can't really speak of the Martians, the indigenous Martians, as extraterrestrials because they're terrestrial within the context of their planet. Now, the notion that some of the more advanced beings with large head and large black eyes and spindly bodies that people are reporting either in their alien contact experiences or in astral experiences involving more advanced life forms, or even upon being taken aboard spaceships, I prefer to call them time ships, the notion that they are time travelers from our own future is possible, but I would aver that, look, if a group of hominids evolves to where they have the intelligence and the form physiologically to travel in time across distant star systems, there would be more evidence that the body type and the large craniums and stuff we find in the visitors is evidence of that. In other words, look, here in our biological context, in our biosphere, human beings with our biological matrix, our bodies, have already time traveled. We don't need to evolve morphologically speaking or genetically to time travel. We've already proven that it's not only possible, but we've done it with Homo sapiens at our level of genetic development. That's namely you and I, this generation. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, when we look at the fact that the so-called spaceships do incredible things like jump from one location to the other in the sky, which implies a mastery of quantum physics that goes beyond rocketry, okay?
Right.
And we look at the fact that we're almost always dealing in alien contact literature with beings that are far evolved beyond what humans are, in terms of how far their eyes are apart, how big their heads are, how small their nose and mouth is, sometimes no evidence of genitalia. I think that bespeaks the fact that they're not evolved humans, that therefore are suddenly capable of time travel, because we know that modern Homo sapiens has already been time traveling, has been doing so for 40 years. I think that that's prima facie evidence that they're from distant star systems. Mm-hmm. So I refute Dan Burrish's position on that as thoroughly developed by him in his testimony to Project Camelot, because I don't think there's support for it. I think the support is that they're from distant star systems. For example, when people have communicated with quote-unquote ETs, I would call them IDs for interdimensionals, but let's just call them ETs. When they've communicated with ETs, they haven't feel that they're time travelers from our future who are more evolved versus us. They've done things like pointed to the sky and said, we're from there. When Marjorie Fish examined the star map resulting from the Benny and Barney Hall abduction of September 1961, she found that the visitors that abducted the form zeta reticuli. Okay, so I don't believe that UFO literature establishes that the beings with large heads and spindly bodies that have been abducting humans and performing medical testing and so forth, the genetic sampling, are from our own future. I don't buy that. I think the vast amount of the data suggests that they're from distant star systems, and they themselves have said they are.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I would
let me also add, when I was a child on Project Pegasus, separate and apart from me and those Martians who were identical to us, I asked my father about the aliens, and they said, we don't know where they're from. So certainly Project Pegasus didn't know they were from our own future. So the claim by Dan that they are has to have been developed by the very same defense technical community that was working with the looking glass technology. Because even though the chronovisors were not called looking glass devices when I was on the project in the early 70s, you know, we're dealing with the same institutions, like the Los Alamos National Laboratory comes up in the looking glass literature that Dan, testimony that Dan provided to Project Camelot. So I'm kind of making a fine point here. I don't want to criticize Dan Bursch's testimony because I think it's very valuable, but I find little notion that the visitors are visitors from our own future, and I'm concerned that it's a mean that's set up to then say, well, we can't have achieved time travel yet because we're going to have to genetically and biologically evolve to accomplish it. I don't think that's what their body types show. I think their body types show that they've been genetically engineered for to survive without food or go great and do the other things that they would have to do to visit us from distant star systems.
I see. The only variable I'd like to throw in there, and this is just from listening to different guests, and that is the thought of the energies that are coming through, whether it be the planetary alignment and all that, and these leaps in evolution. Do you think it's possible that by every 26,000 years, as this energy comes through, there's a leap in evolution that changes the DNA to whether it be the larger heads and the wider eyes and all that kind of stuff?
Well, we know the historical record, and this has been part of the whole debate about the so-called missing link between lower primates and Homo sapiens sapiens. We know that the fossil record doesn't really support evolution. It supports periodic emergence of a new typology, either through spontaneous mutation under some selection pressure that we don't understand, or top-down genetic engineering by a higher life form or creator God, or both. I mean, the notion that, for example, the human race has been genetically modified and developed by extraterrestrials is not a brief for the non-existence of God, because ultimately you have to have a primal creator who began the whole process, what the Greeks called an unmoved mover. So I think it's been part of the debate, in paleontology as to whether we have a complete record that shows a gradual emergence of different typologies under the effect of natural selection, survival, or adaptation following spontaneous mutation, for example, which might occur as a result of radiological or volcanic or cosmological forces or what have you, magnetic. We know that genetic material can mutate under radiological conditions, for example. So I'm open-minded to the prospect, and I hope we're going to be evolving into more refined beings. But I'm simply saying that's not necessary for us to achieve time travel, because one of the things that Project Pegasus proved is that teleportation and other forms of time travel, chronovision, plasma confinement, the Montauk chair, are all things that can be achieved with relatively little injury by modern human beings.
Yeah, that's what I was looking in my mind. I was reviewing what you were saying. I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, I guess you wouldn't have to be of a higher species with these bigger brains and the wider eyes and all that if you've already done it personally yourself.
Right, and you see, if you state that the ETs are not ETs, but they are time travelers from our own future, the tacit implication of that is that further genetic evolution and modification of modern human beings, so they have more insect-like bodies that maybe withstand the thrust of teleportation and so forth, but that we would have to need to reach that level of evolution in time travel, and hence I'm very suspicious of that meme, because I think it may have been artificially crafted to ultimately imply that or ultimately popularize that view.
Such as like
this information. Quite frankly, I resent that because I bear the keloid scars of the quantum access activities that I was involved in childhood. I have dense scar tissue in different patches on my chest, shoulder, and back. And that resulted, I believe, not from the teleporter, made in the teleporter, but from the bright and hot lights we were placed under in the chronovisors. And so, having been injured by the experiments that were undertaken to prove that not only human beings from Earth of this generation, of this typology, but children of this human typology in Earth can time travel, I really have to stand up for what I was involved in, and for us, as a species, we're capable of this.
Right.
We shouldn't constantly cast our power outside of ourselves and say, well, the extraterrestrials can do things we can't, or we're never going to accomplish this. We have accomplished it. Most of the technology came from human geniuses like Nikola Tesla and Enrico Fermi, and we're going to use it to explore the stars.
So do you think some of this information is actually disinformation to, maybe confuse the public or get a person off the track or the trail per se?
Yes, very much so. I'm not saying that that's the case of Dan Bursch's testimony for Project Camelot, because there are so many convolutions to his account that track mine that I'm fairly convinced that Dan is a truth teller. So I want to make that clear.
Right.
But yes, clearly there is a pattern of the U.S. government hiring shills who are paid to sit up there at their computers and craft disinformation that they're convinced is sophisticated, but actually is quite amateurish. I've talked about this somewhat frequently in terms of what I call the high side cover-up. A lot of the disinformation around time travel has focused on stating that the most advanced technologies that the U.S. government developed have been either in the area of psychic research or mind control. So the whole emphasis on the remote viewing program that followed the publication of Jim Schnabel's book about the remote viewing program in 1989, has been to say, well, yes, we have ways of seeing things at a distance. We train gifted psychics to do it. And then, of course, on the Eric Bell show, Ed Dames came along and stated that technical remote viewing is using a special matrix-based framework to guide a very gifted psychic through a non-local event. The problem is that when those parapsychology experiments were being designed and tested, and those methodologies were being evolved in the U.S. intelligence community, simultaneously the defense technical community was developing devices to either literally see a past or future event or to send somebody there. And so the discourse on remote viewing has been intentionally architected to obscure the emergence of these time travel technologies. In a lesser way, the discourse on mind control has been, because I frequently find that when I make my claims and describe how they tried to brainwash me when I was done with the project, but I resisted their brainwashing and survived to tell the tale, with the tail intact, there's always this recourse to, they were affecting your thoughts, you're a victim of mind control. And the whole focus on psychotronic technology is used to displace the emphasis on quantum access technology. So those two forms of disinformation, both of which focused on different technologies, but on the subjective human response to technologies. The technology of using your mind to see things at a distance as a remote viewer, or the effect on your mind of a psychotronic weapon, have been constantly dragged out to confuse and muddy the whole public, the whole understanding of what was achieved in the area of applied time-space physics by 1970. We're talking about a 40-year cover-up here. This cover-up is this cover-up is older than the demographic trend, the demographic group in the United States that watches the greatest number of TV shows and movies, right? This cover-up is older than the current 18 to 35-year-old age bracket. It's a multi-generational cover-up to conceal from the American people that the U.S. intelligence community has been in possession of devices to see past and future events and ways of causing a person to go to a past or future event. And was operational successfully with its technologies by 1970.
So, in your opinion, I mean, I'm sure there's more technology that you're probably aware of and other things that are out there. Why, in your opinion, in your experience, why do you think that the technology is not allowed to come out and better humanity?
Essentially because it was weaponized. Let's take teleportation and then let's take chronovision. Teleportation emerged as a result of the works of Nikola Tesla. When he died at his apartment in the Knickerbocker Hotel in Manhattan on January 9th of 1943, there were two teams racing to go there and seize his paperwork, as Margaret Cheney narrates in her conventional biography of Tesla's life and career. One were two FBI agents, the other were two agents of the War Department. The War Department seized Tesla's paperwork. They got there first and they seized his lab manuals. And Nikola Tesla's papers were never lost. You can open up New Age publications this year and find stories on the lost papers of Nikola Tesla. Not so. They were never lost. They were forwarded to where the world's leading physicists have been gathering in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build the atomic bomb. And they remained weaponized in the context of the post-war growth in the intelligence community in the Department of Defense. So, for example, when Donald Rumsfeld gave his lecture, what he called his meet and greet, to a group of weak teleportees in the terraced amphitheater lecture hall that was one floor below the ground floor of the Cultural Center. In fact, you can see that facility today. It's visible from the ground because there was a fire on that ground floor and the roof of the subterranean floor burned off. And you can look at that briefing room by just walking out there after the compound. I wouldn't encourage anybody to do that because it's not private property, but that conference room is now visible from the ground. But during that April 1971 lecture, meet and greet as he called it, Donald Rumsfeld stated, the primary purpose of teleportation is military. It's going to allow us to put our troops precisely where they're needed on the battlefield. And then he explained how during our later studies of World War II, the United States determined that the majority of our combat fatalities and injuries didn't occur on the front line or on the back lines. They occurred when troops were moving forward from back to the front line. They were shot by snipers. They were shot by friendly fire from behind. They fell into things and drowned and so forth. And so what he explained is that teleportation would allow us to take a military objective by sending people immediately there without having to bring them up from the front. So in the case of teleportation remained sequestered as a military secret. Now, it was tried with the Naval SEALs, and one of the reasons that they couldn't use teleportation landings with the incredibly gifted U.S. Naval SEALs, to being crack soldiers, is that there's always the loss of limbs when a teleportee has contact with water. But they discounted the use of teleportation for naval or marine landings because sailors and Marines are constantly coming into contact with water by the nature of their military profession. But they still sequester teleportation as the military secret because if they want to, let's say, seize the Dome of the Rock with 20,000 troops from Fort Bragg, they can just land them there. Or if they want to put a covert presence on Mars, they already have. They've used teleportation to put people up there. I was one of them. Okay, so essentially teleportation remains a military secret because they viewed it as a military technology. I believe that was incredibly short-sighted and may literally endanger human civilization. Because I believe that if we're going to survive as a sustainable civilization, as our population goes from 6 billion to 9 billion human beings by 2045, we're going to have to create a global infrastructure based on the most advanced technologies that individual human beings and groups have thus far developed. And one of them is the Tesla teleportation that Project Pegasus was researching and developing. Now, in the case of chronovision, that's a little bit more of a sophisticated problem. The problem with chronovision is that it gives you a window to activities going on in the past and future. That's obviously of intelligence value, but it also creates a privacy threat. I use the example of, if we can tune the chronovisor on images of George Washington presiding at the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17th of 1787 in Philadelphia. We could also tune it into images of George Washington making love to Martha Washington or making his last visit to the outhouse. Okay, chronovision is a threat to everybody's privacy, the privacy of everybody who has ever lived, currently alive, or who ever will live. And so there's a concern that it be sequestered to protect people from the public fear, shame, ridicule of seeing private behavior publicized. I mean, privacy is an innate human need. And so I believe that American civilization did the right thing by sequestering chronovision rather than allowing, let's say, all of us to have it on our laptop computers, because doing so protects privacy. Now, the threat of chronovision is that it could be used to create a 24-hour surveillance society by a government that would wish to do so, particularly a fascist, tyrannical government that would want to have everybody accounted for every minute of every day of the year. I believe that something like that, the infrastructure from that may already have emerged. We have the disturbing information about the Total Information Awareness Program that was begun under President George W. Bush. He appointed Admiral John Poindexter of the Iran-Contra scandal as the director of that program. And the goal, supposedly, was to achieve total information awareness in terms of an awareness by DARPA of everything that had been achieved by the government. But I think that may have been a cover, the informational retrieval means. I believe that was, in fact, a cover for a program that was designed to possibly put in place the infrastructure of 24 hours non-local surveillance of the population. And yes, that would occasion the philosophical conundrums that are presented in feature films like Minority Report, in the sense that mean that you would arrest somebody before they committed a crime if you knew they were going to commit it in the future. That brings with it all kinds of philosophical complications, not just threats to privacy. So there are threats to human liberty posed by chronovision and threats to human privacy. Now, the upside of chronovision is that people can be inspired by seeing scenes from past future. Imagine somebody who's depressed, and they're depressed about a particular issue or set of issues. What if you could place them in a psychologist's lab and show them that in a year they were going to be entirely happy and had completely transformed their life? It completely obviated what was depressing.
Right.
Imagine how inspiring it would be for school children to go to the National Archives and see what I was shown when I was a child on Project Pegasus, which were scenes of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. Having the opportunity to see George Washington, somebody like Benjamin Franklin, as they appeared in life, sitting and standing at an auspicious moment in human history. I mean, I think that opportunity should be available to all American school children, not just the 140 of us who were attached to Project Pegasus. And so it's very much a matter of positive and negative capabilities. Even teleportation is a potential threat in the sense that a negative faction, a negative military faction or terrorists or criminals in possession of it could use to flee the scene of a crime or a terrorist attack very quickly. But we haven't outlawed automobiles because automobiles allow bank robbers to speed away. Obviously, if negative factions on Earth could exploit teleportation, it would be a better form of policing and would enhance public security if everybody could teleport. So I support basically universal adoption of teleportation in a controlled way, with teleports that would be civic infrastructure, just like airports were. We don't let people fly over the White House. We don't let 40-year-olds pilot commercial airplanes. There would be controls in place. We would have a professional, government-regulated civilian teleport industry, just like the airport or airline industry. People wouldn't have access willy-nilly to teleport. They then use to commit crimes or to harass other people or to commit acts of terrorism. But we would replace this highly polluting, highly toxic, long-distance air transport with teleportation, at least between major cities around the world. And then in the area of chronovision, these technologies that don't really allow you to visit the location, but view scenes of it, I believe that should be placed on some kind of protectorate where public access to chronovision would be limited, but the benefits of it would be shared with the public.
So do you think that this will ever come out, and if so, how soon? Do you think it's like right around the corner? Do you think it'll be in the next 50 years or 100 years, or do you think it'll always be buried?
Well, that's a great question, and in fact, it was sort of very much part and parcel of the kinds of things I was discussing with my father and that we were learning from the program. The program believed that these so-called Pegasus generation of technologies would not be introduced for 200 years. But I mentioned I was told two discrete things about myself when I was on the project. I later had a discussion with my dad where he talked about how I was going to graduate from law school and pass the Washington State Bar and attend the University of Cambridge in England and other data points about my later accomplishments that he simply wanted to enable me by having me know. But when I was on the project and during different times in my childhood and so forth, there were really two things that I was definitely made aware of. One, as I mentioned, was that my discrete claim that Mars is inhabited will ultimately be proven with societal certainty when better forms of photo analysis emerge that prove my case. Okay, I was literally told that by a briefing agent, a briefing officer to the CIA, a liaison to the CIA. Mm-hmm. The area of the public adoption of these technologies, my own CIA contact officer, Courtney Hunt, told me that I was the bridge between, you remember how Bill Clinton used to ask us to be a bridge to the 21st century? Mm-hmm. Well, I'm happy to tell that I've been trying to be by talking about what I experienced on this project. What Courtney Hunt described is that I'm the bridge between what Project Pegasus was working with, namely things like teleportation, and the ultimate public adoption of them. Because what ends up happening is that the truth movement ends in putting enough pressure. Courtney didn't go into this in great length. Some of this is what I've synthesized from little glimpses of things I heard about my later life when I was on the project as a kid. But when I asked him, am I the bridge between the project and ultimate social adoption of this, he said yes, and he began laughing. Okay, but he didn't want to just outright tell me that. Okay, and so he said I can't give the specifics, but just go with it. Just do the best that you can. Okay, because he was still talking when I had already started my investigation. So do I know that my work is going to succeed? Yeah. Do I know that we have Grand Central Teleport in New York City in 2015 or 2020 or 2030? No, unfortunately, I don't know. I wasn't provided enough information to say, Andy, by the time you're 50, your work has succeeded. I may be gone when my testament about what Project Pegasus achieved is assimilated by society and go and find the devices where they're hidden in dusty storerooms and whatever. I don't think that's going to happen, though. I think that my truth campaign is expanding. I'm getting more and more support from the general public. The disinformation campaign that's been launched against me has proven to be impotent. And so I believe that the ultimate revelation of this technology may even occur during the Obama administration. And if it's not revealed by him by 2012, I'm going to challenge him for his office. And the reason I'm going to, I don't know if I probably wouldn't win, but the reason I will run is because Barack Obama came into office promising change, and he hasn't even given us change around declassification of the extraterrestrial question. What he needs to do to save our planet and to launch a revolution of applied science in the United States is to declassify teleportation. And I'd be happy to meet with him at any time. I met him when we were college students, and he was a nice guy. I'd be happy to meet with Barack Obama at any time to discuss with him my experiences and how we need to declassify this technology so America can lead the world, create the infrastructure of the 21st century.
That's great. We have a couple minutes left here on the show, and I want to thank you for being on the show, and we'd love to have you back. Is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, just the fact that, I'm telling the truth. I had already reached a substantial level of professional accomplishment when I began my truth campaign. There's a natural tendency to disbelieve somebody who is sharing facts that are highly strange. I mean, Carl Sagan talked about the fact that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In fact, he was wrong. Extraordinary claims require only ordinary evidence. And what I've gathered over the last 10 years is the ordinary evidence of extraordinary things that I experienced as a child participant in the U.S. time-space book at the time of its emergence. So I will continue my truth campaign. I appreciate all the support I'm getting from everybody. I hope to have my book completed by the end of the year. I'm kind of tied up in my law practice right now. I've been sharing a lot on radio, but I just want to make clear that I have hundreds of facts establishing that Project Pegasus existed. It was a real defense technical project under DARPA, which was then called ARPA. It involved a range of automatic access technologies that involved different forms of time travel, and that I was in it. And so I would just emphasize again, I have no motive when I began my truth campaign to be lying or fabricating or fantasizing this information. And as I think people hear or see from my account, if I am lying or fantasizing, I'm a creative genius, because I'm not. I couldn't make this up. I'm not Ray Bradbury. I'm not Robert A. Heinlein. I am not a great creative writer, and never was, and never will be. I'm somebody who had the privilege of serving in one of the most important U.S. applied science programs in the history of our country, a program that was as significant as the program that landed men on the moon, and that whose story should be told. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to tell the facts of my experience in Project Pegasus so people can see that something very important that our civilization accomplished was lost. Something that was accomplished 40 years ago was lost, and we don't even have an understanding that we achieved this great accomplishment as a great country because our leadership decided to make it secret. And so I oppose the secrecy regime around these technologies. I will continue to speak out about them, and I believe that my truth campaign will prevail, and I think that the truth will help set us free.
That's perfect. Ed, do you want to give the listeners your website one more time?
Did you say my website?
Yeah, one of your websites or both of them. I think you have more than one, right?
Right. I'm focusing on the technologies that emerged under Project Pegasus, and then more as a natural historian. I'm literally addicted now at this point to looking into the Mars photographs and occasionally finding some kind of incredible anomaly that shows evidence of human or animal life or some new artifact on Mars. So in NASA's images. So what I'm doing is I'm placing information about my truth campaign related to Project Pegasus at www.projectpegasus.net. And that has a companion website where I'm putting my Mars findings and the findings of my great colleagues at the Mars Anomaly Research Society like Ross Curley and Louis Michael Reinhardt and Alfred Lamont Weber and Greg Brown and Paul Goodwin and others who are sending me phenomenal data about Mars. And those findings can be found in the papers that I've posted at the Annals of Mars, M-A-R-S, capital M-A-R-S, at www.projectmars.net. That's our organizational website. And then I have a personal presence on Facebook under Andrew D. Basiago, B-A-S-I-A-G-O. And then we've launched 3 groups related to Pegasus and Mars. I'm administering Project Pegasus, and Mars is administering the Discovery of Life on Mars, which is a Facebook group. And then Alfred Weber and Laura Eisenhower and I have started a 3rd Facebook group called Revealing Mars. And so those 3 websites will focus on different aspects of the overarching cover-up in our civilization. At Project Mars, we'll talk about the technologies. At the Discovery of Life on Mars, we'll show that our celestial neighbor Mars is inhabited, and that this is fraught with profound scientific and diplomatic and philosophical implications. And then at Revealing Mars, we'll go into the linkage between the concealment of these technologies and what's on Mars will go into Marsgate, which is the cover-up of the fact that there is already a U.S. presence on planet Mars.
Thank you so much, Andy, for being on the show.
We want you to walk into Gettysburg so nobody sees you suddenly appearing there, because it's a small town in Pennsylvania. They just had a big battle there 4 months before the day that President Lincoln gives his address there. So we want to drop you off in this nondescript location northwest of town. And it's right here, and you put an X. And then we want you to walk in either direction on this northwest road. And the first person you reach, ask, "Hey friend, which way Gettysburg?" And the people of that time period are very courteous to others, and somebody will clearly help you and point you in the right direction. Essentially, he then explained that when I got on the right road and walked from north down south into Gettysburg, there would be a set of shops that had a sort of a sidewalk in front of them. They were broken up. They almost looked like houses, he said. And if you go south into town, the dais where Lincoln is going to be giving his address is going to be over on your right, near the cemetery. And Lincoln's going to be coming from this distance over here. And he put an X farther to the west. He's staying at the Wills Hotel. He's going to walk east toward the dais. But if you walk south into downtown Gettysburg, you're going to have to wend your way over to the right to reach the platform that he's going to be speaking on. So when you get into town, just ask somebody, where's Mr. Lincoln going to be giving the speech? So that was basically it. I didn't have a lot of training about Gettysburg. I didn't really have a special seminar on the Civil War or its terminology or anything. And they had me go into the plasma confinement chamber, and we did a kind of a dry run. And they said, okay, Andy, next time you walk past that line into the plasma, you're going to find yourself shooting through a series of tunnels. But just relax. It's going to happen automatically. You're not going to have to do anything. And then you'll find yourself popping into view on the side of the road that your dad showed you, northwest of Gettysburg. So just gather yourself up and try to find your way to Gettysburg from that location. So on the actual probe, I walked into the field of plasma that was sort of sparkling with an opalescent hue. There were different pastel colors that you could see forming in the field of plasma. And I walked into the field of plasma, and I almost felt a sort of a trapdoor effect, because I then suddenly felt everything falling away from me. And I was moving rapidly through branching tunnels or wormholes in the quantum phlegm. And this is really hard to describe if you haven't experienced it, but let me try. Basically, I felt myself falling feet first. Just as we had moved feet first when we would go take probes to our own future in the Montauk chair earlier in the project. But this was a sense of actually falling through a set of tunnels. And I would go in one direction in these bright amber-colored tunnels, and then they would branch in all these chaotic directions. I would shoot through one tunnel, and there would be a quick course correction, and I would be heaved in the other direction. And this went on for quite a long period of time. I would say maybe, a minute. It was becoming very, very traumatic. And when I would be turned in another direction as these tunnels branched off, these wormholes sort of corrected where I was going, I realized that part of my clothing was torn off. My hat flew off, my one shoe, and then the other shoe was pulled off my foot and lost. And even one of my socks was lost. And so then I found myself suddenly popping into view on the side of a dirt road with a substantial amount of fog. I could see maybe for 20 or 40 feet around me. And I could see through the fog to maybe a farmhouse, a tree. But I was hot, I was dehydrated, and I was cold. And I stood up, and I kind of looked at myself, and I realized I checked to see my hat was gone. I looked down at my feet. I only had one sock on. My shoes were gone. So I thought, well, if I now walk into Gettysburg wearing no hat and no jacket and no, because I hadn't been outfitted in a jacket in New Jersey. They just put me in this thick jersey, Union Bugle Boy jersey. And so I sat back down again on the ground, and I pulled the other sock off, and I stood up and I threw it behind the bushes because I didn't want to walk into Gettysburg in a state of undress. I'd rather be barefoot than just have one sock on, because then that would attract attention, and we were always trained to avoid any kind of attention that would cause us to be detained, arrested, jailed, confined in somebody's office or house or what have you. In fact, we've been told to even lie to people we encountered when we were time traveling, because their great concern is we would be stuck in a location like a small jail cell where they would be unable to extract us if they needed to put a portal in to take us out of a particular location. But this was a one-off journey in a form of time travel that I was exposed to in this probe to Gettysburg and a few other minor probes that I really have trouble recovering the significance of. They seem to be around the immediate area. Those may have been training exercises or something. But this was for the purpose of going and seeing Lincoln get the Gettysburg Address. So I then started to walk arbitrarily down to my right, down one direction on the road. And about 10 minutes later, I saw through the fog. The fog was beginning to clear as the morning progressed. And I saw a tall, gaunt man, maybe about 19 years old, dressed as a Union soldier. And he was walking along the side of the road, pretty much lost in his thoughts. I can't discount the possibility that he was a young soldier that had been experiencing trauma from having been in the battle. He seemed pretty much lost in his thoughts, almost sort of roaming the countryside. And I yelled, "Hey, friend, which way Gettysburg?" And this tall, very thin, blonde young man quickly turned around and squared his shoulders in the direction that I was already looking, both the direction in front of him on the road, and pointed with more deliberateness than we would use in our time, indicating that I should continue to walk forward because I was walking in the right direction. Of course, there was a 50-50 chance that I would be, because there were only two directions to walk down the road when they put me down on the side of the road. So I guess instinctively I selected the right direction. And I continued to walk behind him. I let him kind of walk ahead because I didn't want to talk to him. So he then sort of walked ahead on the road in front of me. I began to shiver so badly that my teeth were chattering. And the well-trammeled earth of Gettysburg, presumably that troops had traveled on by foot, was very cold to the bottom of my feet. It was almost clay-like. And after about, maybe about 20 to 30 minutes, I began to see that I was walking into, initially I thought just past houses, and then I realized as I got into this cluster of gray sort of 1- and 2-story homes that I had actually reached downtown Gettysburg, because I realized that some of these homes that looked very much like some of the residences that were along the side of the road with some farmhouses and so forth, but which looked a little bit more elegant and which had sidewalks in front of them, were turned in a way that seemed to create a downtown, must be downtown Gettysburg. But I really struggled to see whether I had arrived in downtown Gettysburg, because I was expecting a much bigger town. It was just like a town in the Old West that you'd see in a cowboy movie, except the houses were sort of, they were more farmhouses than Western ranch style. And when I got into downtown Gettysburg, I could see that there would be something that looked like a 2-story house, but there was a wooden sidewalk in the front so that 3 of the adjacent stores were connected to each other. And because I was shivering and wanted to get some clothing, I started to look into the store. I was hoping to go in and ask somebody for a jacket and maybe some shoes. And I was staring into a millinery shop. And during the Civil War, a millinery shop was basically a men's accessory shop. It had things like ties, tie pins, and jackets, and socks, and shoes, and lawful, suspenders, and to the present. And so I had dealt with a lot of those feelings and just doing what they were asking me to do in the project, which was teleport places, be immersed in past and future places, mostly past places, in the chronovisors and so forth. So this was sort of a treat. And my dad said, we want to treat you to something special. And he said, do you want to go to Gettysburg and see President Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address? And my mind immediately flooded with panic, because the image that came to mind was that 1863 image of Abraham Lincoln taken by Alexander Gardner, where Lincoln is staring straight forward and sort of looks like a chimpanzee in a suit. You know, to a fifth grader, Abraham Lincoln could be a pretty scary individual, just based on his historical photographs. And I kind of hemmed and hawed to the point where my father became embarrassed, and Dr. Colgate sort of leaned in to the conversation and said, well, to my father, well, Ray, let's give Andy a week or two to see whether he wants to go to Gettysburg so he can make up his own mind. So I literally marked the calendar back at the house in New Jersey and followed every day for the next 2 weeks, because I knew in 2 weeks my dad would drive me back over to the time lab in East Hanover, and they would ask the same question: do you want to go to Gettysburg to see President Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address? So we went through the same drill. My dad took me over there. I remember going over the railroad tracks on Ridgedale Avenue as you drive up to East Hanover from our home in Morris Plains. Actually, we'd go up Route 10 for a while and then connect to Ridgedale in that location northwest of Morris Plains, and then go up to East Hanover. And I remember going past Florham Park there, which is another small town in New Jersey. So we arrived at this essentially 2-room brick building immediately adjacent to the intersection there. And we walked inside, and my dad and Dr. Colgate again stood in front of me and asked me the same difficult question. And to please my father, I said yes, even though, you know, my stomach was tied in knots and my heart was pounding out of my chest. So my dad said, great. And he kind of steered me across the shop floor and said, Andy, this is Valerie. She's going to dress you in clothing that fits the historical period. So this young lady who was working for Project Pegasus introduced herself as Valerie, and she took me into a dressing room, very much like what exists on a Hollywood set. It was basically a room about the size of a bedroom that was literally covered with historical clothing from different eras. I would say at least 200 articles of clothing. And she said, Andy, we're going to outfit you as a Union Bugle Boy, because we just want you to blend into the historical environment. And so we decided to dress you as a bugle boy. And I said, am I going to be carrying a bugle? And she said, no. And I said, why not? She says, because you don't play the trumpet, you play the saxophone. And we don't want somebody to ask you to play your bugle. So she outfitted me in this immaculate new Union Bugle Boys outfit with a hat, this dark blue jersey, these pantaloon plants, and these shiny new black shoes. And she said, she took me over to the mirror and she said, how do you look? And I said, great, I'm ready to go. I was starting to get excited about going there, you know, looking at myself as a Union Bugle Boy in the mirror. And then she walked me out of the dressing room, like I kind of went ta-da like that to my dad, as if you would when you just been bought a new suit of Sunday clothes. And then my father took me over to a drawing table, kind of a drafting table, and he showed me a mimeograph of a historical map of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863. This wouldn't have been troop movements from the Civil War. This was more in the nature of just a surveyor's map of Gettysburg and the land, the farmland surrounding it. And my father showed me that in Gettysburg in 1863, there was a north-south arterial that then branched off and connected with a road that went north by northwest. And he said, we know this road was here in 1863 because it's still there. And so I was staring in this millinery shop when on the wooden sidewalk in front of the store or shop, and on my right, this old man came barging up onto the sidewalk, hobbling severely from what looked like an injury to his upper leg. So he was really hobbling. And he was 70 years old, and I remember what he looked like. He was a very colorful figure. And as I later could remember from memory what he looked like. And he said to me, boy, what are you doing out here in the cold without a jacket on, without any shoes on? You're gonna catch your grip, lad. Which I imagine was catching cold or getting the flu or something in Civil War parlance. And he said, come inside the shop here, and I'll get you a jacket and some shoes. So he took a skeleton key out of his pocket, and he opened the front door. And I followed him inside, and he went to the back wall, the flip room, which was sort of the store area of the shop, where different men's accessories were on racks, on display and so forth. And he went to this shelving unit that was on the back wall, and he tried several pairs of shoes and held them down to my feet. But none of the shoes that were there, which were all men's shoes, were going to fit my 10-year-old feet. And he said, well, let's try these. And he got a pair of sort of the worst pair of shoes on the wall, which was a kind of a beat-up pair of mint brown street shoes. They weren't military boots; they were actually civilian loafers, or what I would call street shoes. And he put them down on the ground and stuffed packing paper into the toes of the shoes. And he said, well, I'll try that. And we took a long time, actually, maybe about 10 minutes. He was ferociously stuffing people in the front of the shoes. I don't think he realized how oversized the shoes were and what difficulty I was going to have walking in them. But finally, he got enough paper in the front of the shoes where I could sort of shuffle around the shop. And when I was testing out the shoes, a woman in a Civil War dress, clothing, walked through the front of the store and confronted him. I think she was confronting him, why are you sharing our merchandise with this young, bucket bag or whatever she perceived that I was. Or maybe she thought I was what I had been dressed in, which was a Union bugle boy. But as they were having that conversation, she was kind of confronting him, and I could see that he was trying to make up an excuse as to why he was helping me. My perception of time sped up very rapidly and then slowed up very rapidly. So I had this interlude of sort of time dilation that I think was some kind of sensory effect of plasma confinement as a form of quantum access. It was almost as if I had been artificially inserted into a past time, and the way in which my time signature related to the environment somehow got off kilter, so that I heard her speaking very rapidly to him, and then the speed reversed, and they were speaking even lower than normal, and was sort of suspended. So among all the time travel that I did for DARPA and Project Pegasus, the jump to Gettysburg was one in which I could really perceive the difference between myself and the quantum environment that they had sent me to. It was almost as if I had been incompletely inserted to that time and place, and I might pop out of it if something happened. Because I had a sense of density, and I noticed the strange time dilation, or actually time acceleration, and then time dilation when the woman came into the shop and confronted this man. She then left, and he said, come on, lad, let me find you a jacket. And so I shuffled behind them to the storeroom behind the shop. And on the floor there was a lot, maybe 20 to 40 men's jackets. It was a huge pile of jackets, many of them of military issue. All of them navy blue, the ones that were military jackets were navy blue. Well, by 1972, I had done a lot for the program. I had participated in the teleportation research and development activities that DARPA was undertaking between New Jersey and New Mexico and back. I had participated in holographic probes to the past and future in devices called chronovisors, which were located both in New Jersey and in New Mexico. And I had done everything that the program had asked me to do, that Project Pegasus had asked me to do, to the best of my ability. Probably the most unusual thing that we did, which was in the summer of 1972, was we jumped through a Stargate device that was at the Cerrillos Cultural Center compound in Cerrillos, New Mexico, outside of Santa Fe, to retrieve microfilm summaries of future events that were being prepared by project historians situated in the year 2045. So among the 140 school children who had been selected for Project Pegasus, I ended up being involved in some of the most advanced activities, and my father and some of the other project principals were quite grateful that I had. So in the spring of 1972, he took me up to a time lab that was located on Ridgedale Avenue and another intersection in East Hanover, New Jersey. We're still looking for that building. It had previously been a chemical company. And in the lab was a large plexiglass chamber, maybe about the size of a tennis court, or maybe the length and about half the width of a tennis court. And there was a line on the floor inside the chamber, and they would generate an emission of plasma at the end of the chamber. And when you walked into the field of plasma under confinement, in this plasma confinement chamber, you essentially experienced slipping into another time. So my father took me up to the time lab in East Hanover, and I met an individual that I had met in a previous context in Project Pegasus, and that was Dr. Sterling Colgate. Sterling Colgate had been the dean of the physics department and then the president of New Mexico Tech, the New Mexico School of Mining and Technology. And he was responsible for processing the images of future events that were being photoanalyzed and prepared at the Aerojet Corporation facility that was immediately adjacent to the New Mexico Tech campus in the early 70s. There was a C-shaped building there at the corner of Bullock Avenue and Beloit Place in Socorro, and that was the location where, for example, my father and I viewed a short film loop of one of the planes hitting one of the Twin Towers on September 11th of 2001, 30 years into the future. So Dr. Colgate was a project scientist that I had met previously on the project, and when my dad took me over to meet him over in East Hanover, I said, Dr. Colgate, what are you doing here? And then he explained to me, Andy, that the project scientists and engineers are also teleporting, just like you and your father are. And then I realized, oh, of course, it would be just as easy for you to teleport from New Mexico to New Jersey as we have been doing so frequently. And they stood there on the shop floor next to this confinement chamber, and my dad explained to me, Andy, you've done very well in the program. You've done everything that we've asked you to the best of your ability. And I had overcome a lot of fear traveling to other times and places. There was sort of a sense of existential panic that I was sometimes coping with, concern that I would be lost in time and not be able to get home.